Chapter 129, Saved, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Royal Princess Duanjia rubbed the corners of her eyes as she inwardly continued her outburst. Chu Lu, you dummy. You'd better be alive after this. You still owe this princess a whole roast duck. You promised that we'll make it together next time. You can't go back on your promises. Otherwise, this princess will make trouble for the entire house Jing'an, especially that darn annoying husband of yours. Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly had something out for He Changdi. After all that happened, Chu Lian had already become her best friend. Furthermore, Chu Lian was such a nice person, but that He Sanlang actually dared to abandon her. He was definitely a wife-abandoning animal. Chu Lian, still standing in the small courtyard, didn't have the spare time to think of all that. Her heart was thumping rapidly in her chest. It was impossible not to be scared. However, she didn't have a choice. Chu Lian quickly put on Royal Princess Duanjia's coat and ran over to the pile of kindling near the entrance of the closed courtyard. She dove inside in a panic. Under the cover of some dried grass, Chu Lian didn't dare to move an inch. She held the mental map of the courtyard in her mind and calculated the escape route she was going to take. She pressed on her own chest with her right hand and felt the beating of heart. In her heart, she prayed for Wenlan to return quickly with reinforcements. From the gaps in the grass covering her, Chu Lian could see the two pursuers carefully stepping into the courtyard. They were completely covered in black clothing. Even their faces were wrapped up in black, leaving only their sinister-looking eyes peeking out. The swords they held had been covered in blood at some point. Beads of red were rolling down the sharp blades and dripping onto the tile-covered ground. Chu Lian felt like she could almost hear the pitter-patter of the falling blood. Her heart in her throat, she watched every movement that the assassins made. The two men swept the courtyard with their gazes once they entered, as if they were just about to find either her or Royal Princess Duanjia. Chu Lian shut her eyes and took a deep breath. The next time her eyes opened, they were as bright as stars in the night sky. She mentally counted to 3 before pushing aside the kindling covering her. Without any room for further thought, Chu Lian ran towards the entrance of the courtyard. When the two assassins spotted the young girl appearing out of nowhere, one of them quickly followed after her while the other remained in the courtyard. The remaining assassin walked up to the kindling pile that Chu Lian had just been hiding in and used his sword to poke through it. After pushing aside the grass and discovering that there was no one else hiding in there, he spat in anger. After that, he continued looking through the courtyard. It seemed like the assassins weren't stupid. Eventually, the gaze of the remaining assassin landed on the only well in the courtyard. He strode towards the well and lifted the wooden cover on top of it, scanning the inside. Although it was rather deep, the sunlight reached far enough that he could see the bottom. Seeing that there was only a piece of wood floating on the water's surface and nothing else, he harumphed and turned to leave. Hiding under that piece of wood was Royal Princess Duanjia. She waited until a few more moments had passed before she dared to come up for air. In her heart, she cursed the assassins 1,000,000 times over, while worrying for Chu Lian's safety. As her lungs cried out for more air, Chu Lian's steps grew heavier and heavier. The footsteps behind her sounded closer and closer, and it seemed like there wasn't a shred of hope left for her. Under the wide sleeves of her clothes, Chu Lian gripped a golden hairpin she had removed from her head. If there was really no other choice, then she would choose death. She took a deep breath. Death didn't seem so scary in the midst of all this tension. She wondered if she would return to her original world if she died. If she could, the first thing she would do was write a 500-long review to scold the author of this book. The face of her pursuer seemed to carry a wretched smile behind the dark cloth wrapping around his face. His sword was just about to reach her. Chu Lian could almost feel the air being pushed towards her by the blade. All her energy was gone. She was struggling to breathe. She purposely stumbled on her next step, miraculously dodging the assassin's fierce strike. Sprawled on the ground without any more strength to dodge the next attack, Chu Lien turned and stared at the assassin. She pressed her lips together tightly, determination clear on her face. When the assassin finally saw the face of his target, a flash of annoyance passed through his eyes. He had been chasing the wrong person. He angrily shouted, "You damned bitch! You tried to trick me. Since you're not the princess, there's no use in keeping you." Right as he finished speaking, his sharp blade began its descent, its target Chu Lien's snow-white nape. The silhouette of the blade was reflected in Chu Lien's eyes. Her gaze sharpened. She refused to give up. Even at this critical moment, she didn't want to give up. No matter where she was, nothing was more important than her very own life. The spark in her eyes brightened as strength gathered in her body from who knew where. She flipped over and actually dodged the man's attack. At the same time, she rolled next to his feet. She tightly gripped the hairpin in her hands and, without any hesitation at all, plunged it into his foot. The man cried out in pain as his eyes flushed red. Even in his wildest dreams, he would never have thought that this fragile little noble girl could hurt him. He punted Chu Lien away and increased the ferocity of his attacks. That burst of movement has expended the last drop of energy in Chu Lien's body. She didn't have any power left in her to fight. The blood-stained blade flashed, it was going to fall upon her any second now. Chu Lien quickly shut her eyes. Chapter 130, Saved, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. However, the pain she had expected never came. Instead, she heard a whoosh. Chu Lien panted as she laid sprawled on the ground. When she slowly opened her eyes, she saw that the assassin had already fallen next to her, his eyes wide with an arrow through his throat. Chu Lien pushed herself up with difficulty before she looked around. She immediately spotted the azure-eyed man on the second floor, sporting a bow in his hands. That arrow was his. Chu Lien let out a sigh of relief as her body softened into mush. Without waiting for Chu Lien to catch her breath, that whoosh sounded again. She turned to look, a little stiffened, and saw that the second pursuer had also been shot to death with a single arrow. By then, Chu Lien had finally regained her senses and realized that someone had just died right in front of her. Her pupils shrank and her face turned extremely pale. Still leaning on her arms, she began to shuffle backwards, as if trying to get away from the dead men. Not much later, a number of troops charged down from Defing Tea House. The azure-eyed man led them straight to Chu Lien. She saw that the soldiers were wearing armor and carrying swords at their waists. These must have been the reinforcements from the city guards that Wenlon had sent for. The azure-eyed man extended a hand to help Chu Lien up. "Six Miss Chu, are you hurt anywhere?" Chu Lien felt like jelly all over, but she persisted in standing up. She took a small glance up at him before quickly lowering her gaze. Chu Lien pressed her lips together and shook her head. "Your Highness Prince Jean, I'm fine. I just suffered a shock, but I'm uninjured." Once he heard Chu Lien addressing him as Prince Jean, his extraordinary azure eyes narrowed slightly. Prince Jean waved two people forward, and two maidservants immediately came forth from behind him. They gently supported Chu Lien at either side. By this time, Wenlon had also come charging out of the crowd. Seeing that Chu Lien was safe, tears spilled out from her eyes. "Third young madam, it's good that you're all right." Chu Lien tried her best to pull out a weak smile for Wenlon. Without waiting for her to speak, Wenlon knew what she wanted to ask. "Third young madam, please don't worry. Xian is fine. She had a small injury, but the doctors are tending to her in the forecourt of the tea house." Without waiting for the two to finish their conversation, another person rushed forward from the crowd. Chu Lian turned to look and realized that it was Royal Princess Duanjia's handmaid, Jinxiu. The moment Jinxiu came over, she grabbed onto Chu Lian's thigh. She cried out in anxiety, "Third young madam, what about our princess? Where has our princess gone?" Prince Jin glanced at the outer coat that Chu Lian was wearing. When he recognized it as Royal Princess Duanjia's, a trace of understanding flashed through his mind. Chu Lian blushed, the red evident against her pale face. After narrowly escaping danger, she had actually completely forgotten about the princess in the well. She awkwardly coughed to hide her guilt and secretly glanced at Prince Jin. "Come with me." Wenlan quickly moved up to support Chu Lian. When Chu Lian led Prince Jin and the soldiers to that little courtyard, she peeked into the well and saw that there was no one there. Noticing that the piece of wood was still floating on the surface, she shouted loudly, "Princess! Come out quickly! Help has come!" The tough soldiers surrounding them had constipated expressions on their faces. Following that, ripples appeared on the surface of the water as a head suddenly popped up from under the wood, like a water ghost. Royal Princess Duanjia's voice resounded with anger, "Chu Liu! You're late. Hurry and get someone to pull this princess up." Hearing the anger in Royal Princess Duanjia's voice, Chu Lian was finally able to relax. Actually, as Chu Lian reflected on her actions, she admitted it was a little too rough of her to have pushed the princess down the well. She had only been thinking of saving her life, but she hadn't thought of the mental anguish that the saved princess would have been going through. Luckily, Royal Princess Duanjia wasn't such a fragile person. The soldiers quickly prepared some rope and threw it into the well. Once they brought up the soaking wet princess, without waiting for Prince Jin to put the cloak he had prepared around the princess, Royal Princess Duanjia reached out and hugged the dazed Chu Lian tightly. The princess' voice sounded a little hoarse as she whispered into Chu Lian's ear. "Stupid Chu Liu! Do you know how scared I was alone in that well? If I have nightmares after this, I'm going to buy a puppet, paste your name on it, and stick a needle into it every day to relieve my trauma." Chu Lian froze up after hearing the princess's words. As expected, this princess was really hateful. All she had were complaints after she had saved her life. Chu Lian was at a loss for what to do when she suddenly realized that there was something hot flowing down her neck. Chu Lian's heart immediately softened. She patted Royal Princess Duanjia's back lightly and reassured her with a gentle tone. "I'm sorry, it's my fault. If Princess has nightmares in the future, I'll make something delicious for you to eat, okay?" Royal Princess Duanjia was choked with sobs as she pushed Chu Lian away and wiped her tears. She stared at Chu Lian with reddened eyes before pursing her lips. "Chu Liu, are you serious? Don't you dare lie to me. I want to eat that cat head cookie. And your handmade roast duck." "Chu Lian. My dear princess, could you stop changing moods so quickly? My delicate heart can't take it. Are you sure you weren't crying so pitifully just to trick some food out of me?" Chu Lian wanted to roll her eyes at the princess. Chapter 131, Twins, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Prince Jin had been watching off to the side the entire time. The corner of his lips twitched. After bearing with it for a long moment, he gave in and spoke up. "This prince will send some men to escort you back to Prince Wei's estate." It was only then that Royal Princess Duanjia turned around and noticed Prince Jin there. She wiped away the tears in her eyes before asking, "Fourth brother, are you all right?" "Just some minor wounds, they'll heal soon. This prince has to continue investigating with the city guards, so Longqing will escort you back with some men." Fourth imperial brother, please be careful. The maidservants waiting at the side brought over a cloak and covered royal Princess Duanjia with it. With Chu Lian supporting her, the two of them boarded a carriage driven by one of Prince Jin's bodyguards. The carriage went all the way into the main entrance of Prince Wei's estate and even past the screen at the entrance. There, it stopped. Chu Lian alighted before royal Princess Duanjia, so she was the first to notice the middle-aged woman anxiously waiting next to the carriage with a group of maidservants and senior servants. The moment royal Princess Duanjia got off the carriage, she charged right into the arms of the noble lady. "Mother! My good child! You've scared mother to death today." The group of servants flew into a flurry of activity when the princess alighted from the carriage. Some of them brought clothes, while others brought over warm braziers. In this panic, Chu Lian didn't forget her manners. Although she couldn't move forward, she made a perfect bow to Princess Wei. Although Princess Wei was concerned with her daughter's condition, she still kept an eye on Chu Lian from the corner of her eye. Noting that Chu Lian hadn't shown a single shred of panic or fear, she inwardly gave a nod of approval. After a moment, when royal Princess Duanjia was warmed up again, she remembered that Chu Lian was still waiting at the side. She quickly pushed aside the servants surrounding her and tugged Chu Lian closer. "Mother, the only reason I'm still standing before you today is all thanks to Chu Lu." Princess Wei raised an elegant eyebrow. "Oh." One of Princess Wei's most trusted servants saw that royal Princess Duanjia was about to continue speaking, so she hurriedly spoke up and suggested, "Royal Princess and House Jingyan's third young madam have just narrowly escaped calamity. Why not drive away the bad luck first by stepping over these braziers? If there are things to say, surely it can wait until later in Princess Wei's room, after a nice warm bath." Princess Wei nodded and called someone to bring a small brazier in front of the two young ladies. Royal Princess Duanjia insisted on holding Chu Lian's hand as they stepped over the braziers together, so Chu Lian had no other choice but to follow. After that, the two of them were sent to the bath in Princess Wei's courtyard. Princess Wei sent a handmaid over to serve Chu Lian. The handmaid thought ahead and prepared a set of clothing for her to change into after her bath. When the two young ladies had changed into a fresh set of clothes, they came out from behind the changing screens supported by some maidservants. They took one look at each other and burst out into laughter. The servants wiped their hair dry as they sat together in front of the dressing table. Royal Princess Duanjia turned to look at Chu Lian, then at herself, before pointing at a set of accessories on the table. "This, and this. Put them on this princess and Chu Lu." Chu Lian glanced at the accessories and quickly tried to put a stop to it. "Princess, I can't do that. That's a phoenix tail hairpin." Royal Princess Duanjia wasn't happy. "Why can't you wear that? It's not like it's a special five-tailed phoenix hairpin. Even a titled noble wife can wear one." The corner of Chu Lian's lips twitched. She didn't even have a noble title, so how could she wear that hairpin? Royal Princess Duanjia harumphed. "That He San Lang is really useless. What good is he other than being a little handsome? He's like an embroidered pillow. He couldn't even get a noble title for his wife. How were you so blind as to choose him? Don't worry, Chu Lu. Just put this hairpin on first. This princess will get you a noble title later on." This sounded really strange, regardless of the context. For one, the people here believed in having their parents choose their marriage partners, so she hardly had a choice in who to marry. If she had known earlier that He San Lang had such a crazy personality, she wouldn't have wanted to marry him. Chu Lian was helpless. She couldn't win over royal Princess Duanjia, since the princess had a much higher status. Not to mention, she was the guest here. In the end, Chu Lian couldn't say anything. Chapter 132, Twins, 2. Princess Wei was still waiting in the parlor outside. When the two young ladies were done dressing up, they walked into the parlor holding hands. Princess Wei was stunned for a moment. In her eyes, two young ladies, around the age of 14 or 15 and about the same height, had just entered the room. The girl on the left was wearing a light pink dress made out of soft silk with wide sleeves and a translucent overcoat. The girl on the right was dressed in the same style, but with a different color, light purple. The two of them had similar figures and had adorned themselves with the same hairstyle. Even the hairpins and accessories on their heads were exactly the same. Only their expressions and features were different. However, they were both tender young ladies in the bloom of their youth. No one could shift their gazes away. In an instant, everyone in the room was dazed from the sight. Royal Princess Duanjia tugged Chu Lian forward with her a few steps. She tilted her head to one side and asked, "Mother, what do you think? Do we look pretty?" It was only then that Princess Wei came to her senses. Her gaze still seemed misty, and she hurriedly tried to hide the trace of pain in the depths of her eyes. One of her senior servants noticed that something wasn't right and quickly poured a cup of tea for Princess Wei to help her hide her sorrow. The senior servant then smiled happily and replied, "Royal Princess and third young madam, you both look beautiful dressed like this. This old servant is almost blinded by how pretty you look." Senior servant Lan usually has high standards. Since she thinks that we're pretty, then we definitely must be. Chu Lu, see, this princess made a good choice, right? Chu Lian's heart was almost in her throat. How was this good in any way? Royal Princess Duanjia was way too oblivious. If she were to dress in the same clothes as her host in any other estate, it would be considered very disrespectful towards her hosts. In this case, that would be the two princesses before her. Luckily, it seemed like Princess Wei hadn't taken it badly, so Chu Lian heaved an inner sigh of relief. Senior servant Lan didn't have the time to care about what the two young ladies were thinking. She glanced at Princess Wei's expression from time to time. Her hands had also traveled to Princess Wei's back at some point and were patting the princess back gently, as if comforting her. Senior servant Lan sighed in her heart. Who would have expected Royal Princess Duanjia's careless gesture to have pierced right into Princess Wei's most painful spot? No one knew of this other than Prince Wei and the old servants who had served at Princess Wei's side back then, not even the two young princes. At the birth of Royal Princess Duanjia, Princess Wei had given birth to twins. Both of the twins were daughters, but only one survived. They weren't able to save the other. To prevent others from using this event to claim that Prince Wei's estate was unlucky, Prince Wei made the decision to cover it all up. Even now, Royal Princess Duanjia didn't have the slightest idea that she had a twin sister who had passed away. Other than their looks, Chu Lian was similar to Royal Princess Duanjia in age and figure. Now that she was dressed in the same set of clothes as Royal Princess Duanjia and standing in front of Princess Wei, didn't they seem like a lovely pair of sisters? To Princess Wei, it was like she was looking upon the daughter who had passed away so early in life. How could her heart have possibly remained unmoved? Chapter 133, Twins, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Princess Wei took in a deep breath. By the time she set down her teacup and raised her head, she had already calmed the turbulent emotions in her heart. She cast a careful, measuring gaze over the two young girls in front of her, before reaching out to pull them closer. She stroked Royal Princess Duanjia's forehead and patted Chu Lian's little hand gently. When she caught sight of the phoenix tail hairpin in Chu Lian's hair, her eyes narrowed and she sent an admonishing glare to Royal Princess Duanjia. Good, good. This princess ordered these 2 bolts of fabric a few days ago. It looks like the dresses turned out well. Look at these 2 girls, they look like sisters dressed in the same outfit. Royal Princess Duanjia's reply was a bright smile, like her mother's reaction was only to be expected. On the other hand, Chu Lian was shocked. But she managed to hide it well, not forgetting to issue a standard polite reply as she said, "It's Royal Princess Duanjia who has good taste." Alright, the two of you must have suffered much shock today. This princess has arranged for some guards to send Chu Lu home. On another day, this princess will personally send an invite for Chu Lu to come and spend time with this princess and Royal Princess Duanjia. She hadn't realized that time had passed so quickly that it was already evening. Royal Princess Duanjia knew that it wasn't appropriate to keep Chu Lian any longer, so she could only agree to sending Chu Lian home with the estate's guards. Royal Princess Duanjia even escorted her all the way to the entrance. Even when Chu Lian was boarding the carriage, she still seemed reluctant to let her go. "Chu Lu, don't forget, you promised to cook roast duck with me." Chu Lian patted Royal Princess Duanjia's hand in comfort. "Princess, you should return quickly. Don't let Princess Wei worry. I won't forget about our promise. I'll even bring cat head-shaped cookies with me the next time I come, too." It was only after Chu Lian's carriage had departed that Royal Princess Duanjia returned to her estate, accompanied by her maidservants. One of Royal Princess Duanjia's handmaids, Jinshou, had already explained the whole course of events today to Princess Wei. Senior servant Lan shared her thoughts. "It really was all thanks to House Jingyin's third young madam that our young princess made it back safely today. No wonder the young princess is unusually close to her and treats her like a sister. Even to the point of reliance," went on said. Princess Wei's gaze was a little darkened. She suddenly stood up and entered her bedroom deeper within the building. When she pressed a certain spot behind a table, a small door appeared on one of the walls of the bedroom with some calligraphy hanging on it. Princess Wei passed through the door and walked right up to the incense table filled with offerings. She took up the small memorial tablet on the table and wiped it gently with her handkerchief. When she heard the soft footsteps behind her, Princess Wei could no longer hold back her tears. She asked, "Momo, do you think it's little Anir who has come back? Back then, that lady doctor told me, little Anir passed on the moment she was born because she wanted to protect her little sister. She gave all the nutrients she had in her mother's womb to her little sister, so she couldn't survive. Now Duanjia has been saved by her again." Senior servant Lan's heart ached for Princess Wei, but she noticed that the princess looked a little off. Princess Wei's body had been injured during the birth of the twins, and she could never have any more children. The firstborn young princess hadn't taken her first breath after leaving her mother's womb. Thus, Royal Princess Duanjia became even more precious to Princess Wei, and she showered her with all the affection meant for two children. That lost little princess became a sore spot in Princess Wei's heart. Although she had never mentioned it before, she had prepared this altar for the lost princess. However, it was clear that Princess Wei's heart had never recovered from the loss, and it seemed like her mental state was deteriorating. Senior servant Lan had also taken a good look at House Jingyin's third young madam today. If that third young madam had been someone with impure motives, she would have definitely persuaded Princess Wei out of her dangerous mindset. However, sixth Miss Chu had saved Royal Princess Duanjia without caring for her own life. Senior servant Lan sighed with emotion and went along with Princess Wei's belief. Perhaps that sixth Miss Chu really does share some fate with her. Although she's already married, she's the same age as our young princess. Even her figure and looks are somewhat similar. If they had gone out in those dresses today, perhaps they might have been mistaken for sisters. Since she saved the young princess, it's perfectly normal for princess to treat her well. Princess Wei seemed to be reassured by senior servant Lan's words. She caressed the small tablet in her hands and placed it back onto the altar, her eyes a little misty. "Momo, you're right. That child deserves better. Furthermore, she saved my Duanjia today." Senior servant Lan saw that Princess Wei had recovered her usual calm, so she finally relaxed. Meanwhile, Chu Lian had gone through a roller coaster of emotions today. It wasn't until she boarded the carriage that she could truly relax. As Wenlan fanned her from the side, Chu Lian leaned against the carriage window and shut her eyes to rest. After a short moment, she asked, "Where are the clothes and accessories I changed out of?" Chapter 134, Lucky Jade Amulet 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Xian quickly brought out a wooden case from one side. "Third young madam, the accessories you were wearing this morning are all here. As for your clothes, the princess's senior servant said that they were stained with bad luck, so they were burned together with the royal princess clothes in the braziers." Chu Lian nodded and took the wooden case from Xian's hands. Xian had only been injured on her elbows and legs. The rest of her body was completely fine. She opened the case and rummaged through its contents. Chu Lian's expression instantly darkened. She searched once again. All the accessories she had been wearing were still there, except for that lucky jade amulet. "Xian, when you were putting my things away, did you see that jade amulet I was carrying at my waist this morning?" Xian was also extremely tired and tense. When she heard Chu Lian's words, her face immediately turned pale. She looked into the wooden case and recalled that third young madam had indeed been wearing a jade amulet this morning. However, now it wasn't in the case. "Third young madam, when this servant was putting away the accessories, this servant didn't see the jade amulet at all. What?" Chu Lian collapsed against the side of the carriage, the events from the original story continuously flashing through her mind. That lucky jade amulet had been gifted by Matriarch He during the tea ceremony. Later on, Chu Lian had given it to Xiao Bojian during one of their clandestine meetings as a token of their love. Xiao Bojian had worn the amulet at his waist every day after that. Of course, He Changdi coincidentally caught sight of it and quarreled with Chu Lian when he got home. However, Chu Lian had completely ignored He Changdi's anger. She had also been brazen to the point of meeting Xiao Bojian in front of He Changdi's very nose. Chu Lian felt a headache coming on. Xiao Bojian couldn't possibly have picked up the jade amulet that she lost by accident, right? If that really happened, she wouldn't be able to wash her sins away even if she jumped into the Yellow River. However, thinking back to the events at Defing Tea House and recalling the distance she had run to avoid the assassins, she had most likely dropped it somewhere along that path. If the city guards picked it up, there might even be a possibility that they would return it to her. That thought helped Chu Lian calm down a little. Her mind was a mess right now. However, Xian suddenly knelt in front of her with a thump. "Third young madam, it's all this servant's fault. This servant failed to take care of your possessions. Please punish this servant." Chu Lian's eyes opened wide in shock. She then sighed and helped Xian up. "This has nothing to do with you. I was the one who carelessly lost my amulet. You couldn't possibly have kept an eye on my accessories the entire time. Forget it, it's just a single jade amulet. I'll ask Royal Princess Duanjia if she has seen it the next time we meet. Perhaps it'll turn up somehow." Xian secretly checked Chu Lian's expression and found that she really wasn't angry. Her heart was full of guilt, but at the same time, she felt that third young madam's temper had gotten much better. If this had happened when they were back in Hao Xinghua and third young madam had lost something, it would have been their fault for not taking care of her things, and they would have been punished severely. Now that she thought about it, back then, third young madam had been obsessed with riches. However, now she seemed not to care about these material possessions as much. Perhaps third young madam had become more forgiving after marriage. As she thought along these lines, Xian started to sympathize with third young madam. Chu Lian didn't have the time to care about the direction of Xian's thoughts. She was near speechless at how she had been able to bump into Xiao Bojian despite all her effort in dodging him. She had a strange feeling that there was some hidden hand guiding all these events along. Chu Lian pouted in a fit of temper. She was going to be more careful the next time. She refused to believe that she wouldn't be able to dodge that Xiao Bojian. She didn't want to be involved with that damned Xiao Bojian one bit. Her carefree days were much more important. Anyone who dared to disrupt her lazy days would be making an enemy out of her. Chapter 135, Lucky Jade Amulet, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The carriage slowly made its way through the streets. Just as they were about to reach the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian instructed Wenlan to rearrange her hair. Then, she would change back into the accessories she had been wearing when she left this morning. Her hair had been arranged in a maiden girl's hairstyle back at Prince Wei's estate, so she definitely had to change out of it before she returned to her husband's home. The phoenix tail hairpin that royal Princess Duanjia had made her wear also had to be removed, otherwise it would be another cause for wagging tongues. However, she couldn't change out of the dress that royal Princess Duanjia had given to her. The news that Chu Lian had returned to the Jing'an estate quickly made its way to Matriarch He and Madame Zhou's ears. Chu Lian knew that she couldn't possibly hide the day's events, so she didn't return to Songtao Court upon reaching the Jing'an estate. Instead, she took Wenlan and Xian with her to Qingxi Hall. The waiting Madame Zhou also brought her servants with her as she headed to Qingxi Hall. The two of them met in the corridor outside. Chu Lian had already sensed the discontent that Madame Zhou seemed to hold for her, so she made doubly sure that her every gesture and action was courteous and in line. "My greetings to eldest sister-in-law." Chu Lian bobbed in salute to Madame Zhou. Madame Zhou moved forward a few steps to help her up, however, her gaze was looking Chu Lian up and down. When she recognized the fabric that Chu Lian was wearing, something shook in the depths of her eyes. Despite that, on the surface, she was full of smiles. "Sister-in-law, you seem to be wearing a different dress than the one you were wearing this morning." Soft silk. An imperial tribute. Even the imperial family didn't get much of this fabric. It was an imperial tribute from the small country of Sinan. Only titled noble wives were allowed to wear them. Consort De had gotten 2 bolts of this fabric last year and had given half a bolt to Heir Ding Yuan's wife, Madame Huang. Madame Huang had used all of it to make a dress. When she wore it to the orchid appreciation party amongst the titled noble wives, she had looked outstanding and garnered much admiration. However, Chu Lian was now wearing a dress made of that very same fabric. Another headache started building in Chu Lian's head. She knew this was going to happen. She gathered up every shred of her patience to explain everything to Madame Zhou. "Eldest sister-in-law, something happened at Prince Wei's estate today. Let's enter Qingxi Hall first. I'll explain everything to you and grandmother together. This dress I'm wearing belongs to Royal Princess Duanjia, and she's simply lending it to me temporarily." Madame Zhou was shocked. Royal Princess Duanjia's dress. When had Chu Lian gotten so close to the princess? How could Royal Princess Duanjia have given her such an expensive dress just like that? Judging by how new and pristine it looked, it seemed like the princess had never even worn it after it had been made. Madame Zhou suppressed the shock in her heart and followed Chu Lian into Qingxi Hall. It was only after explaining everything to Matriarch He and Madame Zhou that Chu Lian could drag her exhausted body over to Songtao Court to rest, escorted by senior servant Liu. When Madame Zhou returned to her own courtyard, her mind was reeling. She hadn't expected such a windfall to have fallen into Chu Lian's lap after a simple trip outside. Not only had she built a connection to Prince Wei's estate, but even the normally unapproachable Prince Jean was now in her debt. With things as they stood, Chu Lian would definitely be making another visit to Prince Wei's estate. Madame Zhou had already started making plans in her mind. After senior servant Liu returned from sending Chu Lian back to Songtao Court, she saw that Matriarch He was still sitting in the parlor. The candles around her flickered, casting her face in alternating light and shadow. She seemed to be deep in thought. Senior Servant Lu walked up to the matriarch's side and gently massaged her shoulders. "Matriarch, are you thinking about what happened to third young madam today?" The matriarch heaved a long sigh. This old woman could have never expected that girl to bring about such change. Perhaps it's due to third young madam's courage, intelligence, kindness, and how much she values friendship. Otherwise, she wouldn't have thought up a plan to save Royal Princess Duanjia under those circumstances. If this old servant is permitted to say more, then His Highness Prince Jean was also saved thanks to third young madam today. If not for third young madam sending Wenlan to get the city guards, how could they have caught the assassins so quickly? TL note: I met up with Ed Volare and some other Volare staff in Singapore last weekend, and there are pics over here for our Volariversary celebration. http://Volare-novels.com/Happy Volariversary Volare turns 2/ Chapter 136, Lover's Token, 1. Of course I know all that. I just didn't expect that the wife I happened to pick out for San Lang would turn out to be such a lucky star. Isn't it so? If third young madam continues her friendship with Prince Weiss estate, it'll be tremendously beneficial for our estate. Prince Wei was extremely close to the current emperor, yet he wasn't involved in politics. His house was also known for being morally upright. Having connections with Prince Weiss estate would only bring them benefits, and no harm at all. Matriarch, this old servant isn't sure whether to speak freely. Matriarch, he glared at Senior Servant Lu. You silly servant. There's nothing that you can't say freely in front of me. Senior Servant Lu paused her massage and moved over to face the matriarch. Matriarch, this old servant wonders if you noticed eldest young madam's expression today. This old servant is afraid that eldest young madam's thoughts may be straying towards the wrong path. Matriarch, he sunk into silence. Dalong's wife. When Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court, she had a quick meal with some snacks before returning to her bedroom. It had been a physically and mentally taxing day for her, so she intended to go to bed early and get a good night's sleep. Regardless of the troubles currently plaguing her mind, Chu Lian determined that leaving the pondering to tomorrow was a better course of action than keeping herself up the entire night today. Fuyan pushed aside the gauze curtains on the bedchamber. First, she glanced at Xian, who was standing ramrod straight as she guarded the chamber. Next, she peeped at Chu Lian, lying on the bed. Although nothing showed on her expression, her curiosity was burning. She hated that she couldn't immediately question Xian about what had happened today. She wanted to know if third young madam had met Mr. Xiao today while out of the estate. Was she secretly having an affair with Mr. Xiao? That high-quality dress that third young madam had changed into was also suspicious. She couldn't possibly have changed into it after meeting Mr. Xiao, right? All sorts of scenarios played out in Fuyan's mind. When she thought of third young master's cool and handsome face, she pinched her palm for courage. Third young master was so good-looking. If third young madam had betrayed third young master, she wouldn't let it continue. Though Fuyan was so hung up over He Changdis looks now, if she could see what He Sanlang looked like as he roughed it out at the northern border, she probably wouldn't be using the word handsome to describe him anytime soon. Xiao Bojian had already escaped to Fen Tea House long before the city guard's arrival, but that didn't mean he wasn't close by. Standing inside a fabric store opposite the tea house, Xiao Bojian repeatedly clenched his hands into fists at his side. His eyes were murky, as if he were struggling inside. Finally, he turned and spoke to one in a low voice. Why don't you go to Defing Tea House and see how Lianer is doing? The expression on the bodyguard's average-looking, forgettable face seemed to flicker for a bit. However, in the end, he didn't disregard his master's request. He grunted in acknowledgement and merged back into the crowd on the street. After an hour, one was back. Xiao Bojian had already moved to a room on the second floor of the fabric store. He sat behind a desk, a calm expression on his face. However, his voice betrayed the anxiety he felt inside as he asked, "How was it?" One cupped his fists. Reporting to Master. 6th Miss Chu is already safe. Master can relax now. The city guards have already taken down all the assassins. Xiao Bojian caught the thread of hesitation on one's face as he spoke. His expression darkened. What are you trying to hide? Speak. Chapter 137, Lover's Token, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. One was most afraid of the darkly sinister look that sometimes graced his master's face, and it was this exact expression that he was wearing right now. One's body trembled a little as he pulled out an exquisite piece of jade from his sleeve. He respectfully offered it up to his master with both hands. Master, this subordinate found this in 6th Miss Chu's private room. Xiao Bojian reached out and took the jade amulet in hand. His slender fingers caressed the surface of the amulet. He recalled that this was the amulet that Chu Lian had been wearing today. It was a quality piece of jade, and the carving was finely detailed. He could tell that it was of great value at one glance. The carving on this jade amulet was beyond compare. It was also perfectly sized so it could be worn by either gender. The embroidered string that it hung on was a bright pink, perhaps since Chu Lian had been wearing it. If it were changed to a dark blue or green string, it should be fine for a man. Xiao Bojian didn't think that Chu Lian would carelessly leave behind such a valuable piece of jade in the room. There was only one possibility. That she had done it on purpose. As for who this jade amulet had been meant for, he was the only man who had visited that room today, so the conclusion was clear. With a burst of emotion, Xiao Bojian clenched the amulet in his hands, a glint flashing through his eyes. When he heard one's report, the longing he felt in his heart grew even stronger. He never knew that his Lianer could be so smart and calm. Even if it had been him in that situation, he might not necessarily have been able to make the same bold and brave decision that Chu Lian had. Saving the 4th prince and building ties with Prince Wei's estate, his Lianer was truly one of a kind. The light in Xiao Bojian's eyes shone even brighter. Every time he discovered another one of her merits, it was even harder for him to let go of her. Even though she was already married to someone else, his covetous heart had never loosened its claws on her, not once. He was the only one fit for his Lianer. He had been planning on approaching Chu Lian slowly, creating more chances for the two of them to meet. However, that he Sanlang had wisely backed out and left for the northern border all by himself. Then he didn't need to act recklessly. He had all the time in the world to come up with a plan, to make his beloved woman walk step by step into his carefully prepared trap, and finally become his. Though he was still in the midst of building up his base of power, there wasn't any need to fear a small house like House Jing'an. Although the Jing'an estate was full of military officials, the current emperor heavily favored the literary officials. The only exceptions to this were the dragon and tiger guards. Other than the border generals, there were hardly any military officials with some sort of influence in the court now. Once this year's autumn examinations began, it would be his time to shine and display his ambition. One was watching the changes in his master's eyes as he held on to the jade amulet. He coughed twice and carefully asked, "Master," when this subordinate investigated the assassins for a moment, this subordinate noticed that there were black imprints on their left forearms. Black imprints. Xiao Bojian's eyes narrowed slightly. When one noticed that Xiao Bojian wasn't speaking, he continued his report. As far as this subordinate knows, black imprints were a secret imperial technique from the previous dynasty. There are venomous worms in the imprints. When these assassins fail their mission, the person controlling the main worm can activate those black imprints to force the assassins to commit suicide. Xiao Bojian waved his hand and didn't say anything else, simply acknowledging the report. Upon noticing his master's expression, one didn't continue speaking. However, he did continue that line of thought in the safety of his own mind. Were the mysterious assassins sent to kill the fourth prince and royal princess Duanjia by someone supporting the previous dynasty? They had changed to the Great Wu dynasty for many years now. Even if there was a remaining trace of the old imperial bloodline, they should have slowly faded into nothing by now. How could they have had the power to send assassins after a prince and princess in broad daylight, never mind in on one of the main streets of the capital? The mystery of the assassins would require further investigation to resolve. Chapter 138, Lover's Token, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. The morning after saw Chu Lian rising much earlier than usual, as she had gone to bed early last night. She had already decided what to make for breakfast the night before. It was going to be refreshing vegetarian wraps, paired with a light and salty vegetable porridge. After breakfast, Chu Lian noticed it was still early and went back to her little study to practice her calligraphy. She had some talent in calligraphy already, and she had experience in writing simplified Chinese words with pens. Now all she had to do was learn to use a brush and write in traditional Chinese words instead. She wasn't used to it at first, but after practicing for a few days, she had no problems writing most of the commonly used words. However, it was impossible for her to write exactly like Chu Lian had. Firstly, she wasn't good at copying. Secondly, there weren't many examples from the former host of this body that she could reference. Besides, she was herself and she wasn't going to try to imitate the original Chu Lian. They were two completely different people in the first place. Although using a brush and writing in traditional Chinese words were easy enough, she still had a long way to go before her calligraphy could be anywhere close to passable. Chu Lian was more used to using pens instead of brushes. She got Xian to find some goose feathers and made her own feather pens. When she wanted to practice writing fancier characters, or writing for longer amounts of time, she would switch to the feather pens. After filling up 2 sheets of paper with her calligraphy practice, Chu Lian made her way over to Qingxi Hall to give her daily greetings to the matriarch. Afterwards, she intended to stop by her mother-in-law's courtyard for a visit. Who could have known that Chu Lian would receive something she hadn't expected at all, a letter from He Changdi all the way from the northern border. Matriarch He had a wide smile on her face as she passed the letter over. She was acting just like she was watching her cute pair of grandchildren being lovey-dovey right in front of her. The corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. She kept her expression neutral as she took the letter, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. The matriarch mistook this as Chu Lian simply being shy, so she dismissed her with a wave of a hand to let her read the letter in private. Matriarch He even reminded her to write a reply after she was finished reading. The man who had brought them the letters was still waiting to send everyone's replies back together to the northern border. Seeing Matriarch He's pleased expression, Chu Lian felt like she was out of her depth. When she recalled what senior servant Lu had told her last night while escorting her back to Songtao Court, Chu Lian's mood took a turn for the worse. Senior servant Lu's words played again in her mind. "Third young madam, please don't blame this old servant for speaking up about this. The Countess hasn't been in the best of health since the birth of third young master, so this old servant was the one who took care of him from childhood. This old servant feels warm just watching the two of you interact so well. But now, third young master must be suffering over at the northern border, and our master can't help him either. He's all alone over there without a companion he can share his troubles with. Although it's been so hot as of late over here in the capital, it's actually terribly cold over there, especially at night. I've heard that it's impossible to survive without a jacket on. Third young master left in such a hurry, this old servant doesn't know if he brought enough supplies." After Senior Servant Lu had dragged on and on in this vein, Chu Lien instantly understood. She only had one purpose, that was to make Chu Lien, as Sanlang's wife, send more care for the He family's lonely, suffering third young master. If she could be a caring and considerate wife and prepare some changes of clothing and such for her dear husband, it would be great. As much as Chu Lien wanted to roll her eyes, she couldn't say anything to Senior Servant Lu. She could tell that Senior Servant Lu genuinely cared for He Changdi. She treated him like her very own son. There was nothing wrong with those kinds of feelings. Chu Lien agreed to it. Despite how terribly He Changdi acted in front of her, she was still his legitimate wife. There were expectations she had to fulfill according to that role. As for that crazy husband of hers, as long as he wasn't around to disturb her, there was nothing to worry about. Chu Lien's thoughts were plain and simple. When she returned to her study, Chu Lien sat alone at her desk. She measured the thickness of the envelope with her fingers. It seemed pretty thick. There must be quite a few pieces of paper in there. TL note: food porn is back, in vegetarian style. XD vegetarian wraps, Vietnamese, vegetable porridge. Chapter 139, Reply. 1. There were a few boldly written words on the front of the letter. To my dear wife, Madam Chu. A corner of Chu Lien's lips lifted in amusement. She wondered if he felt any guilt at all while writing that down. Calling her his dear wife, yeah, right. He hadn't even been willing to consummate their marriage. Did he have a conscience somewhere in that head of his or not? Chu Lien tore open the letter and pulled out a few pieces of paper. Now that she could see the contents, he really had written a whole stack of letters to her. Each page was packed with tiny little words. She had to get as close as possible to decipher them. But the moment she tried, her face instantly turned dark. What the heck was this? The handwriting on these letters were so bad that they looked like exorcism amulets. She couldn't understand a single one. No, wait. She was able to understand 2 words. The big, bold words at the start of the letter, Chu Lien. After that warm, my dear wife on the front of the envelope, He Sanlang still ended up addressing her by her full name, Chu Lien, in the letter itself. Even though she couldn't really make out what the letter was about, just based on those 2 words alone, Chu Lien could understand that He Sanlang hadn't written anything good about her in that letter. She pursed her lips. Luckily, He Changdi's handwriting was so terrible that she couldn't read the letter. Otherwise, she would have probably gotten angry and expired from the force of her rage. She carefully folded up the letter and placed it back into the envelope, then tucked it away in a fragrant rosewood box. Then, Chu Lien prepared some ink and picked up her brush to start writing a reply. He Changdi had written out 3 whole pages while full of anger, all to warn the wicked woman Chu Lien against trying any of her tricks while he was gone. If he were to find out that she hadn't even read a single word of it, perhaps he might even spew out a mouthful of blood. If he were to also find out that it was all because of his flowery handwriting, perhaps he might also regret trying his best to show off his calligraphy skills. After thinking for a long time, Chu Lien still didn't know what to write as a reply to He Changdi. She wrote a few words, before staring at the remaining blank space on the paper. Her eyebrows furrowed together and she quickly scrunched the paper up into a ball and threw it into the fire. No way, it was impossible. Although her handwriting had improved, it was still miles apart from someone who should be used to writing with a brush. It wouldn't be good to expose her lack of skills to He Changdi by writing a letter. What if he started getting suspicious? That husband of hers was already crazy enough, she couldn't risk provoking him anymore. Since she couldn't write, how was she supposed to reply He Sanlang's letter? Chu Lien scratched her head in frustration. Somehow, Her gaze landed on the set of goose feather pens and charcoal that she usually used for practicing. Her eyes instantly lit up. Oh yes. Although she couldn't write, she could draw. For an art enthusiast like her, those simple little comics with 4 boxes were easy as pie. Now that she had a plan, Chu Lian immediately started putting it into action. She took up her brush and with a few strokes, a lively, interesting drawing started to take shape on the paper. The little person wearing a dress with a lopsided hairstyle was herself. With a few simple, quick lines and some nice brush strokes, the paper was filled with quite the animated scene. In less than an hour, Chu Lian had already drawn 20 comics. She couldn't even fit the whole stack into the envelope. Finally, Chu Lian called Xian into the study. Xian, help me find a larger envelope. Xian was still dazed by the request. She was wondering what Chu Lian needed such a thing for. If she wanted to mail something larger, she could just use a package. Chu Lian waved the stack of paper at Xian, and the maidservant immediately understood. TL note, food porn in 2 more chapters. Chapter 140, Reply, 2, this chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Xian hurried out with a smile on her face to look for another envelope. She bumped into Senior Servant Gue outside the bedroom. Senior Servant Gue found it strange that the normally calm maidservant had a bright smile on. Xian chuckled. Momo, you should have seen it. The size of the reply that third young madam has written for third young master's letter. It can't fit in a normal envelope, so this servant is going to find a much bigger envelope to fit it in. As Xian was speaking, she even gestured with her fingers to show how thick the stack was, with some exaggeration, of course. Senior Servant Gue chuckled along with her. She recalled that third young master had sent back a letter for their third young madam. It must have been something he'd written that had made her so happy. Why else would third young madam have so many things to say? Her reply couldn't even fit in a normal envelope. Good, that's good. This old servant will help search for one as well. In the end, they had to make a request to the steward of the outer court for one. The fact was that such big envelopes were rarely used, so they didn't have any in the estate. In the end, it was the steward who used leather to fashion one in a stroke of genius. There was a special feeling to it when Chu Lian held it in her hands, almost like the file holders back in the modern era. Senior Servant Gue and Xian happily watched as Chu Lian personally put the thick stack of papers into the envelope and sealed it. She even wrote the words, "To my dear Sanlang," on the front. The 2 servants imagined their third young madam stuffing the entirety of her sweet little heart into that large envelope. Remembering Senior Servant Lu's special reminder, Chu Lian had Senior Servant Gue find a cloth for wrapping up a package. She packed up a few of He Changdi's inner clothes, cloaks, winter clothing, shoes, and so on. These had already been made for He Changdi anyway, so Chu Lian didn't need to do a single thing. Senior Servant Zhong was also present in the room. A corner of her lips lifted in appreciation. In her heart, she nodded. Third young madam really did have third young master in her heart. She even knew to pack up some clothes for her husband. The courier had already told them that he could help bring some things over, but not too much, or it wouldn't be very convenient for him. Matriarchy also knew how strict the army camps at the northern border were, so she didn't try to make things difficult for the courier. She even specially told Chu Lian of the package limit. After preparing a small bundle of things, Senior Servant Zhong had already brought the younger maidservants out to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Senior Servant Gue thought for a while before deciding to stay behind. She helped Chu Lian tidy up the bundle before commenting, "Third young madam, this old servant heard that the northern border is extremely barren, there's not much to have there. Third young master must be used to a comfortable life here in the capital. He might not be able to get used to the northern border. It's possible that his appetite is suffering as well. He must surely miss the fine cuisine back here in the capital. Chu Lian couldn't understand what senior servant Gue was trying to say. She tilted her head in confusion as she looked at senior servant Gue. Her eyes were bright and moist, and she even made a cute sound in questioning. Didn't he decide to go there by himself? He didn't even tell me beforehand. It's none of my business, even if he suffers there. Senior servant Gue sighed inwardly. That's not what this old servant meant. This old servant was simply saying that third young master is most likely not sleeping or eating well. Didn't you have Xian and the other girls make some snacks a few days ago? Only those who were fortunate enough to taste the splendors of Chu Lian's secret recipes would know the temptation of food. As the saying went, the primary necessity of the people is food. In the ranking of all of life's pleasures, food was number one. Just take senior servant Gue for example. After getting used to eating the dishes made from third young madam's recipes, she would probably look down on even the most famous restaurant in the whole entire capital now. Those fine cuisines were complete garbage when compared to the food here at Songtao Court. Their third young madam wasn't good at much. In the past, she had some skill in brewing sincha, but since she refused to even touch the tea now, this was the last remaining skill that she could show off. Who didn't like to eat in this world? Especially good food. No one could possibly dislike it. There was nothing good to eat over at the northern border. If third young madam were to send something nice along, wouldn't third young master be tremendously happy? TL note, food porn in one more chapter. Chapter 141, Reply 3. After listening to senior servant Gue, Chu Lian remembered that she had taught the girls how to make a whole bunch of snacks on a particularly boring day. Since they usually had some spare meat left in the kitchen that would spoil if they couldn't finish it, Chu Lian had the girls turn them into all sorts of meat-based snacks. There was pork jerky, translucent shredded beef, spiced beef jerky, and many more. This was the first time she had made these kinds of snacks since coming to the Great Wu Dynasty. There actually wasn't all that much meat left in the kitchen too, so they only had a few bags worth, even after spending all that effort to make them. Even the handmaids weren't given any, the jerky was meant only for her. That translucent shredded beef was still soaking in a small jar, waiting to be eaten in 2 days. However, senior servant Gue was now suggesting that she give all her hard-won snacks to He Changdi. How could the greedy Chu Lian bear to part with her food? Momo, it wasn't easy for me to make those snacks. I haven't even eaten more than a few pieces. I've been craving them for so long. Anyway, that translucent shredded beef was just made. I don't know if it can be eaten now. What if it doesn't taste good? Senior servant Gue hadn't thought that the usually generous third young madam, who could even bear to reward her servants with silver accessories without batting an eyelash, would suddenly turn into such a miser. She couldn't even bear to part with a few bags of snacks. Senior servant Gue felt helpless. She knew that third young madam's childish temper was going to flare up again, so she patiently tried to persuade her. Third young madam, how could anything you made not taste good? Don't worry, this old servant has tasted it already. That translucent shredded beef is delicious. Chu Lian's eyes widened in disbelief. She pointed at senior servant Gue and said poutily, Momo, you ate my shredded beef in secret. Senior servant Gue didn't expect that she would expose herself in a moment of carelessness. She awkwardly continued, this old servant simply tasted it a little. Didn't third young madam say before that it would be done after soaking for 4 to 5 days? This old servant was simply helping third young madam conduct a taste check first. Chu Lian was extremely put out. She had been wondering why her beef jerky had been running out so quickly. So it was senior servant Gue who had been sneakily eating some. Why were the people around her such gluttons for food? Wasn't it enough having just one glutton around? Senior servant Gue realized that they had strayed from the topic at hand, so she quickly pushed it back to the right track. It was this old servant's fault for stealing third young madam's snacks. This old servant promises not to steal any more snacks and to watch over Xian and the rest. Third young madam, there isn't much left, and it won't be enough for you anyway. Besides, we can make them any time here. If you send it to third young master and he likes it, he might even begin to long for you. It'll all be thanks to these snacks, if you send them along. Chu Lian was a little motivated by senior servant Gui's words. That was true. She could make them any time she wanted, but it was impossible for He Changdi up in the north. It was also true that there wasn't much left anyway, as much as she liked them. She was simply trying to have some other flavors to spice up her usual meals. Fine, she would give the remainder to He Changdi. Alright, Momo, get Xian to bring the snacks over. Put them into a small bag alone and ask the courier to take special care of it. Very well, this old servant will do so now. Senior servant Gue quickly rushed off to find Xian. The pork and beef jerky had a long shelf life as long as they were careful about not letting them touch water. Thus, Chu Lian wasn't afraid of the food spoiling before it reached the northern border. TL note, return of food porn. When I searched for these, it turns out that there are lots of brands for all these snacks out there. Maybe you guys can try buying some and letting me know how they taste. I've only had pork jerky before out of these 3 snacks here. 3 Poor Chu Lian getting her precious snacks stolen. Or's translucent shredded beef pork jerky, spiced beef jerky. Chapter 142, Jealousy. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Xian was also happy that third young madam was finally thinking about third young master. In her excitement, she took out all of Chu Lian's snacks and packed them up, including a few pretty little blue cloth bags and the small jar of translucent shredded beef. Though it wasn't much, it was just enough for a small package. On the other hand, when senior servant Gue looked at the package, she felt that it was too small. Wouldn't sending such a small amount reflect badly on their young madam? Thus, she took the initiative to take out the grape wine that Chu Lian had fermented a few days ago. After adding 1 bottle into the package, senior servant Gue was satisfied. Poor Chu Lian didn't know that all of her snacks had been offered up by Xian. Not even her grape wine, which hadn't been easy to make either, was left untouched by these 2. Once both the letter and package had been prepared, they were sent on their way to the outer court. By then, the entire estate knew that Chu Lian was going to send a giant letter to He Sanlang. The main steward retold the story in front of the other stewards, boasting that he had personally made that huge envelope for third young madam's letter. The faces of matriarch He, Countess Jing'an, and heir Jing'an were filled with gratified smiles upon hearing this bit of news. They praised Chu Lian, exclaiming that Sanlang had really married a good wife. Thus, the letters that the other family members intended to send to He Changdi were full of praise for Chu Lian, noting that she was both sensible and filial. It was probably only Madame Zhou's letter that didn't contain something nice about her. All of House Jing'an's letters and packages were quickly sent to the northern border. Within the study room of Prince Jin's estate, the usually cheerful Tang Yan had lost his smile. His expression was extremely grave. He glanced towards the seemingly relaxed Prince Jin, sitting at the head of the room with his eyes closed and resting. Your Highness, the city guards just sent some news over. The assassins we captured all died overnight. Prince Jin's startlingly blue eyes instantly flickered open. Have you found any leads? All of the assassins had a black imprint on their left arm. After examining the bodies, we suspect that the imprints are part of a secret technique from the previous dynasty to control kamikaze warriors. Send people to continue the investigation. check on the background of Defing Tea House as well. Tang Yan indicated that he had received his orders and left. Prince Jin's long, elegant fingers tapped gently on the table before him. His eyes seemed to have darkened, showing hidden depths. Everything that happened in Defing Tea House played in Prince Jin's mind once again. He hadn't forgotten how Chu Lian had been able to recognize him at first glance back then. Although he was part of the imperial family, and even held the status of fourth prince, he wasn't as favored as the other princes. His mother had passed away long ago, and his mother's maiden family was too weak. Thus, he had no support to speak of. He was already 18 this year, and had left the palace 2 years earlier to establish his own estate. After moving out, other than for the major court meetings held twice every month, he didn't enter the palace often. In their earlier years, he and Changdi had regularly visited the military camp located in the outskirts of the city, so he was familiar with most of the military officials at court. Otherwise, he couldn't possibly have arranged a position for Changdi at Liangzhou. However, the Great Wu dynasty favored literary officials over the military. Thus, not many cared that he was making connections with the military officials. Due to his uncommon eye color, the emperor had already told him in private that a prince with mixed blood would never be accepted in the competition for the throne. Thus, Prince Jin had never sought to fight for it, even in his younger days. This was also the main reason he had been given an official title of prince and sent out of the palace to establish his own estate much earlier than the rest. Perhaps in 2 more years he would take a wife and be sent off to some other territory, but for now, he was allowed to spend his days in the capital mostly idle. Prince Jin's abnormal eyes were one of the taboos in the imperial family. With his reclusiveness, not many people knew of this strange trait of his apart from some trusted officials at court. Even if people found out about this fact, few of them would dare to discuss it openly. As much as Prince Jin wasn't favored, he was still one of the imperial sons carrying the bloodline of the emperor. Despite this, Chu Lian had been able to identify him at first glance. 6th Miss Chu had simply been a forgotten little miss of House Ingwa before her marriage. She had probably never attended any important feasts in her entire life. He Sanlang wouldn't have mentioned him to her either. And judging from He Sanlang's attitude towards her during the first few days, did he really seem like someone who would share intimate details of his life with 6th Miss Chu? Not at all. Prince Jin hadn't been dressed like a prince that day in Defing Tea House. However, Chu Lian had been able to tell who he was the moment she had met his gaze after coming out of her private compartment. She had clearly recognized him. This was getting interesting. He Sanlang. You've been pretty fortunate to have picked up such an interesting wife. Not only was she in contact with some strange man, she seemed to be hiding a lot of secrets. Prince Jin didn't dare to guess at what 6th Miss Chu was thinking. However, it was a fact that Chu Lian had sent her servant to bring the city guards back, saving his life. Prince Jin knew how to repay his debts. He wouldn't refuse to acknowledge Chu Lian's efforts in saving him just because his good friend, He Changdi, happened to despise her. Chapter 143, Jealousy, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian spent 2 peaceful days in the estate. She was already starting to consider the revival plan for Gillen Restaurant. In 2 more days, she would ask Matriarchy for permission to go out and take a look at the restaurant herself. It was almost mid-autumn soon. The estate was starting to prepare the necessary items for the colder months ahead. The temperature outside was getting lower, thanks to a few rounds of autumn rain, and it had become much cooler. After having breakfast at Songtao Court in the morning, Chu Lian gave her morning greetings to Matriarchy as usual. She bumped into Madame So while she was there. Matriarchy took a sip of tea. Perhaps due to the coming of autumn, Matriarchy had added some dried chrysanthemum flowers into her sencha today, giving it a fresh burst of flavor. While looking at the floating yellow petals in her tea, Matriarchy suddenly remembered something. She immediately said, "It's almost autumn now. It's about time for all the courtyards to get additional clothes made. Dalong's wife, have you finished the preparations?" Madame Zhou had just picked up her cup of tea. She hadn't expected Matriarchy to mention this matter to her so abruptly, but she quickly replied, "Please don't worry about it, grandmother. The steward in charge of the needlework has already mentioned it to me. I've already given them my orders. The new clothes for this season will be made in the most trendy styles of the capital." After saying so, she turned to look at Chu Lian, who was sitting opposite her. Her eyes seemed to dim a little before she continued to say, "Third sister-in-law has just married in this year, and she's so young and pretty. I took the initiative to add 3 more sets of clothing for third sister-in-law. Does grandmother have any other requests?" It seemed like Madame Zhou's reply had satisfied Matriarchy. You've done well, Dalong's wife. Since Sanlang isn't in the capital, we should be taking care of Sanlang's wife as her senior family members. In my opinion, when it's time for each courtyard to get new accessories, why don't you add 2 more sets for Sanlang's wife? This granddaughter-in-law understands." Although Madame Zhou replied positively, beneath the surface, she had taken offense. Giving Chu Lian a few more sets of clothing was already considered special treatment, now she even had to order more accessories to be made for her. A single set of clothes wouldn't cost more than 100 taels, regardless of the quality of the material used. However, 1 set of accessories could cost at least 100 or more. They would have to be high quality, too. Upon thinking that Matriarchy had suddenly added on 500 to 600 taels of expenses with just 1 sentence, Madame Zhou felt extremely put off. Matriarchy didn't know the cost of things since she wasn't managing the household accounts. The stores and fields that the estate had under their name didn't produce much annual income for them. None of the masters present in the Jing'an estate knew how to manage businesses, so after deducting the necessary expenses for upkeep and maintaining connections with other houses, they didn't have much money left. Once Countess Jing'an used up her own funds, her medicine expenses would be shifted to the general accounts. 1,000 taels a month was not a small sum. By then, it would be hard to manage this estate. When Madame Zhou thought back to when she had first married into the estate, she recalled that Matriarchy had never treated her this well. Jealousy and frustration took root in Madame Zhou's heart. Chu Lian wanted to say something, but it wasn't her turn to speak. She could see that the look in Madame Zhou's eyes was changing, and cried bitterly in her heart. "Ah, my dear grandmother, aren't you creating trouble for me? How could their third branch get any extra accessories when the main branch wasn't getting any?" Chu Lian was about to speak up and reject the offer when Matriarchy cut her off. "Sanlang's wife is so young, it's just the right time for her to dress up. A few accessories shouldn't cost too much, furthermore, our estate should be able to spare that much." The matriarch's gaze landed on Chu Lian's abdomen. Chu Lian choked and couldn't bring herself to speak. What else could she say? The matriarch had already had the final word. Madame Zhou, who had her eyes trained on Matriarchy, immediately caught the look she shot towards Chu Lian. Alarm bells rang in her head. She couldn't help the frustration she felt pressing like a heavy weight on top of her chest. Her face flushed red from the strength of her emotions. After Chu Lian and Madame Zhou headed to Countess Jing'an's courtyard together for a visit, Matriarchy called her trusted senior servant Zhou over. She asked in a casual tone, "Is there any news about Sanlang's wife?" Senior servant Zhou's face crinkled up and she replied with difficulty, "I heard that third young madam had her monthlies yesterday." Matriarchy's face was filled with disappointment. It looked like the great-grandson she had been looking forward to wasn't coming this year. Senior servant Zhou tried to comfort her. "Matriarch, although third young madam comes from House Xinghua, third young master only stayed a few days after they got married. How could she fall pregnant that easily?" Matriarch sighed, looking crestfallen. You're right, I was too hasty. When Chu Lian took her leave a step ahead of Madame Zhou, Countess Jingyan kept Madame Zhou back, intending to say a few words in private. Mother, is anything the matter? Countess Jingyan's face was pale as she leaned against the headboard of her bed. Every once in a while, she would cough. As she held on to Madame Zhou's hands, she slowly said, "It's almost time for the seasons to change. Since it's almost autumn, there are many preparations to be done around the estate. It must have been tough on you." "Mother, what are you saying? It's all part of my duty." Madame Zhou felt comforted by her mother-in-law's words. The lingering frustration she felt from Qingxi Hall began to dissipate, and she managed to squeeze out a refreshed smile. "Mother has also been in your position, and Mother knows how tiring it must be. While working to keep our estate running, don't forget to take care of your own body." I understand, Mother." After a short pause, Countess Jingyan spoke up again. "Sanlang's wife has just joined our family. As her eldest sister-in-law, do take care of her a little more. Why don't you give her an extra set of accessories this season?" The rage that had just been quelled instantly flared up again. So her mother-in-law had simply been saying those comforting words to pad her request for Chu Lian. Ha! How nice! All the senior family members were thinking of the third branch. Wasn't it just because Sanlang had gone off to the northern border? But that was Sanlang's own choice to go. Shouldn't the blame be placed on Chu Lian for not managing to keep him here? All of them wanted her to help make up for Sanlang's absence, but who was going to make up this slight to her? She and Chu Lian were both legitimate wives of the estate. Chapter 144, Chillis, 1. After Madame Zhou had finished agreeing to her mother-in-law's requests, she walked out of Countess Jingyan's courtyard with a tense, fearsome expression. The servants following behind were so afraid that they didn't even dare to breathe. Madame Zhou suddenly paused in her steps and turned around to ask the senior servant behind her, "How is it? Is there any news from Songtao Court?" This senior servant was well aware that her mistress wasn't in the best of moods today, and it would be far too easy to make it even worse. So when her mistress asked her a question she could answer without fear, the senior servant breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Eldest young madam, please don't worry." This old servant heard that third young madam's schedule ran as usual. After getting a definite answer, the knot in Madame Zhou's heart finally loosened. How fortunate, how lucky that Chu Lian hadn't gotten pregnant. If Chu Lian were to get pregnant and give birth to the eldest grandson of the house, how would she be able to keep her position as the wife of Heir Jinggan? That's right, did Heir Jinggan say when he would be coming back today? One of the maidservants behind her answered, Heir Jinggan said he would be going to Honglu Temple this morning. It seems like he's meeting with some outsiders there. When he left, he mentioned that there'd be no need to wait for him for the midday meal. Tell the kitchen to prepare his share anyway. How can the food of those restaurants outside possibly compare to the food of our estate? Yes, eldest young madam. This servant will send the orders now. Her senior servant walked forward to support Madame Zhou's arm. With some emotion in her voice, she said, "Eldest young madam is always so considerate. I believe Heir Jinggan will be able to feel eldest young madam's painstaking care when he comes back." Madame Zhou's expression was still a little dark upon hearing these words from her trusted servant. Dalong did treat her very well. If her body wasn't up for it, Dalong would only rest in his study, and he would never summon one of the maidservants to quell his urges. She probably wouldn't be able to find more than a handful of men who could control themselves like this in the entire capital. One of House Jinggan's rules prohibited the men from taking concubines unless they were still without an heir upon turning 30. For Dalong, that age was fast approaching, and she still had yet to give him any sons. Were the happy days of their peaceful, loving marriage about to end, just like that? The more she thought about it, the more her worry showed in her eyes. Changchi was meant to inherit the title of Count Jingon. How could he not have any heirs of his own? Even if Changchi didn't mind it, the Count and Countess, as well as matriarch couldn't possibly not mind. The grape wine that Chu Lian had been fermenting for the past few days was now ready to drink. Since senior servant Gue had taken the initiative to send off one of her gourds to Changdi, Chu Lian was a little angry. She held on to her remaining wine gourd and kept eating long past her usual amount during the midday meal. As a result, she ate too much and her stomach was a little bloated now. It wouldn't be good for her body if she immediately went to nap, so she brought Wenqing and Jingyan along with her for a walk in the gardens to digest her meal. Although it was close to mid-autumn, it was still a little hot outside. Chu Lian favored walking along the more cool corridors, and somehow made it all the way to the entrance that connected the inner and outer courts. There was a set of stone tables and chairs in the bamboo forest near the entrance, so Chu Lian stopped and sat for a short rest. She intended to head back for a nap afterwards. Right as Chu Lian sat down, she heard the sounds of an ongoing conversation near the outer court exit. Who knew her original plan would be derailed just like that? Jingon, what should we do with this whole carriage of chilice? Your heart is too soft. You bought up his entire stock just because that outsider claimed he didn't have enough money to go back. Hand it over to the estate steward. If they're really useless, just throw them away. That kid was so pitiful, I just wanted to give him some money to help him get home. It was the slightly coarse voice of Dalong that spoke. Chapter 145, Chilice, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but she could recognize her eldest brother-in-law's voice, so she was a little curious. Thus, she sent Wenqing off to ask about what was going on. In a short moment, Changchi walked over with his manservant, Kangshou. Chu Lian quickly stood up to greet him. Third sister-in-law, how did you come to be here in the middle of the day? Chu Lian smiled. Replying to eldest brother-in-law, I ate too much in the afternoon, so I'm taking a walk in the gardens to digest my meal. I walked all the way here without realizing and happened to notice eldest brother-in-law's voice outside, so I sent my maidservant over to check. Eldest brother-in-law, where did you go? Have you taken your midday meal? Chu Lian looked sweet and pretty. Adding on to the fact that she had been quiet and obedient after marrying into the estate, as well as having earned a good reputation for herself at the Dingyuan estate, Changchi had a very positive impression of this newlywed sister-in-law of his. He was so used to being the eldest sibling that he would dote on the younger members of the family even more. Although he looked a little fierce on the outside, he had a kind heart. Chu Lian was his little brother's wife. With Changchi's character, of course he treated her like his own younger sister. I've already had my lunch. I went over to Honglu Temple this morning to meet some outsider friends. Third sister-in-law, did you know? Those outsiders really do have red hair and green eyes. Changchi spoke in such an interesting manner that Chu Lian's eyes brightened with interest. Eldest brother-in-law, did you eat the food the outsiders made? Of course. Is their food very different from what we eat in our Great Wu dynasty? After hearing Chu Lian's questions, a constipated expression came over Changchi's face. Combined with the tan of his skin and his large build, he looked exactly like a pouting bear. It was very funny, but Chu Lian and her maidservants managed to hold back their laughter, thanks to their status. That meal. Let's not talk about it. It tasted so bad that he wanted to tear up. After eating that strange meal, Changchi had started to pity those outsiders. Otherwise, he wouldn't have spent tens of taels to buy that carriage of useless chilice. He recalled what those outsiders had said, that those chilice were a type of food. However, after he and Kangshou had a bite, their mouths were on fire. They had to gulp down 2 whole cups of tea to even come close to calming the burning of their tongues. Casting a look over the curious and sparkly-eyed sister-in-law of his, Changchi had a sudden idea. "That's right, I bought something from those outsiders today. They told me it was a type of food. Does third sister-in-law want to take a look?" Chu Lian happened to be super curious about it, so how could she reject the offer? Thus, she followed Changchi through the entrance to the outer court. Changchi waved his hand at the 2 manservants moving some goods out of the carriage. Changchi lead her over, and when they got close enough, he personally took up one of the cloth sacks and opened it up for her. Chu Lian peeked in, only to see that the bag was full of dried chilies. Their skins were red and shiny, and they had teeny tips. Cute. Chu Lian tried to stay calm, but she couldn't help but get excited at the sight. "Eldest brother-in-law, what are these?" Changchi seemed to feel that these goods weren't useful at all. He simply twisted the sack closed before tossing it back onto the carriage. "The outsiders who sold this to me told me they're called chilies." Chu Lian had to gulp down the saliva that had unconsciously begun to pool in her mouth. I wonder if eldest brother-in-law could give me some of these chilies. I want to use them as ingredients to cook with." When Chu Lian mentioned food, Changchi remembered the snacks that she had made over the past few days. These chilies were useless to him anyway, so why not give them to Chu Lian? "Third sister-in-law, if you want them, you can have them all. These things are useless to me." Chu Lian hadn't expected her eldest brother-in-law to give her the whole lot just like that, so she was a little shocked. She wanted to reject the offer, but Changchi's manservant spoke up, "Third young madam, these chilies aren't worth much, they're just some goods that a young outsider brought into the capital." He wanted to sell it for a good price, but he didn't expect that no one even wanted to buy them. He was in a rush to go home, so he came to Jing'an looking for help. Jing'an took pity on him and gave him some tails so he could go home. This carriage of chilies just happened to be something extra. "If you don't want these, the steward is most likely going to toss everything away." TL note, I'll be translating today's bonus chapters starting now. I'll post them as I finish them. Come chat with me in the general voice channel on Volari's Discord server. I'll also be checking TMR's discussion channel, #TMRnevercomes, for anyone who can't join the voice channel. Here's the invite link https://discord. GG/P76AXMR. Also, have a Merry Christmas today, everyone. Love. Chapter 146, Chilies, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. No one had managed to recognize what a good ingredient these were. No wonder the outsider had to sell it for so little. Since they had gotten these chilies so cheaply, Chu Lian didn't continue to decline the offer. To be honest, this carriage of chilies would only be able to reach their full potential in her hands. Then many thanks to eldest brother-in-law. If I cook anything new with these chilies, I'll send a share over to eldest brother-in-law. It's a deal then. Kangsho, call up 2 female servants to move all these chilies to Songtao Court's kitchen. After giving away the burdensome chilies, Changchi felt refreshed. He then returned to his own courtyard with his manservant. Of course, Madame So had already received the news of what had happened. Madame So sat in the parlor with an unhappy expression, clearly angry. The moment Changchi entered the parlor, he noticed that his wife didn't seem to be in a good mood. He walked over and took a seat by Madame So. Yuanjing, what happened? Did any of those silly servants make you angry today? Madame So felt even more frustrated upon hearing him say that, but she couldn't bear to take out her temper on her dear husband. She could only smooth out her expression and quietly ask, Dalong, you brought a carriage full of something back from Hongla Temple today. Although Changchi looked like a rough man, contrary to his appearance, he was very sensitive to the hidden meanings behind words. Thus, he immediately realized that his wife's thoughts had gone down the wrong path. Oh you! What are you thinking? Those were just some goods that some outsider kid didn't manage to sell off. He brought them all the way here to our capital, but couldn't manage to sell off his stock for an entire half a year. I took pity on him and spent 20 taels to buy those, just to give him some money to help him get home. When Madame Zhou heard this, she relaxed. What was it? Just a carriage full of some chillis. Women were still a little more narrow-minded. Even Madame Zhou, who had grown up in House Dingyuan, wasn't an exception to the rule. She hit Changchi lightly. Even so, you can't give all of it to third sister-in-law. If I don't give them to her, am I supposed to just throw them away? I don't know what to do with them, and you don't know what to use them for either. Even if we keep them, they'll just spoil. It's just 20 taels, why do you care? Madame Zhou couldn't stand it anymore. She turned her back to Changchi. All right. Yuan Jing, I'll bring a headdress back for you tomorrow, how about that? It's the latest style from Jinshi Pavilion. I ordered it for you a few days ago. Now that I think about it, it's about time for it to be done. Once Madame Zhou heard that her husband had ordered a headdress for her from Jinshi Pavilion, that paltry sum of 20 taels was completely tossed to the back of her head. She quickly started questioning Changchi about what the accessory was made of and the style it was made in. Jinshi Pavilion was the most famous accessory store in the whole capital. Even princesses and influential officials' wives often ordered accessories there. Having a headdress from Jinshi Pavilion was something worth showing off. Changchi's words had finally assuaged the depression that Madame Zhou had been in, thanks to matriarchy and Countess Jingyan's talk about giving Chu Lian more accessories. After eating a little with his wife, Changchi went to his study with his servant, Kangshou. Changchi sat before his desk and instructed, Kangshou, take 1,000 taels over to Jinshi Pavilion and get them to make a headdress for me. Tell the shopkeeper that this order is from me, and I won't tolerate any mistakes. Kangshou was about to turn and leave when Changchi called him back. Don't take the money from the estate's accounts. Take it from my personal funds. Yes, sir. Kangshou quickly left to perform the errand. Changchi was a little worried over his finances now. It wasn't like he didn't have any personal funds, but these days, he had been secretly helping out with his mother's medicine expenses. Even if he had a mountain of gold, it would run out eventually. He had already detected his wife's unhappiness, so he chose to use a headdress to soothe her ruffled feelings. How could he have possibly have ordered it in advance? He had only said so to make Madame Zhou happy. Chapter 147, Poached Fish Slices. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. If his father wasn't stationed at Mingzhou, and if the heir didn't have to be around for the family, Changchi would have actually preferred to join the army himself. However, since he was the eldest son, he had to let go of his dream and stay at home to take up the responsibility of his absent father. Changchi's position was merely a slack fourth-ranked official. He wasn't good at business either, so although he was House Jingyan's heir, he didn't have much funds at hand. As the heir to a count's estate, the only reason he had started worrying about money was because of his mother's condition. Chu Lian didn't know any of this, as she wasn't managing any part of the estate, it was all happening in the background. The original story hadn't made any mention of these details either. After getting a full carriage of chillis, Chu Lian was dying of happiness. Her mind was already full of chili oil, spicy spring chicken, boiled mutton, sour and spicy soup, fried spicy shredded beef, mapo tofu, and all the other spicy dishes she could think of. When she got back to Songtao Court, she immediately rushed into the small kitchen without bothering with an afternoon nap. At the entrance of the kitchen, senior servant Zhong and Wenlan were staring wide-eyed and tongue-tied at the servants carrying in sacks of something into the kitchen. That carriage of chilies managed to fill up half of their small storehouse. Senior servant Zhong went up to Chu Lian and asked while gaping in shock, "Third young madam, what is all this? Why is there so much of it?" Chu Lian smiled so widely that her eyes had narrowed into slits. She purposely skirted around the topic and said, "Momo, don't worry, it's something good. Eldest brother-in-law gave them to me. From Jingyan." Senior servant Zhong followed behind Chu Lian and watched as she opened up a sack and got Jingyan to bring some big wooden basins over. Chu Lian then held up the sack that went up to her knee and poured out the dried chilies, making a satisfying sound as they fell en masse into the basin. Senior servant Gue rushed over after getting the news. Upon seeing this basin of fiery red somethings, she exclaimed in surprise, "What are these? They actually look kind of pretty." Chu Lian reached out and ran her hand over the stack of chilies. Looking at all the fresh, bright red chilies, a mischievous thought sprang up in her mind. She turned to look at her gathered servants with upturned eyes and said, "This is a food from the outside. They're edible even without cooking. Would you like to try some?" The first ones to nod were the younger maidservants, Shiyan, Fuyan, and the others. Their eyes were full of expectation. Third young madam was just too good at cooking, whatever she made was always delicious. They even thought they looked a little chubbier in the mirror, and that was only with 2 days' worth of observations. Before each meal, they would tell themselves to eat a little less this time, but they just couldn't control themselves once they saw the food. It was extremely frustrating. When Chu Lian saw that they were willing to try out the chilies, and she couldn't hold back the smile on her lips, she stepped aside and let them reach into the basin. The younger maidservants took 1 dried chili each. After glancing at it once or twice, without asking about its flavor, they shoved it straight into their mouths. In less than 2 seconds, their throats were on fire. They quickly spat out the chilies and rushed into the kitchen to find some water to drink. Senior servants Gue and Zhong had watched the whole affair from the side. They were shocked silly when the maidservants took off. What just happened?" Senior servant Gue wanted to follow after the maidservants to see if they were okay, but Chu Lian held her back while trying to suppress her smile. "Momo, it's okay, they'll be fine. All they did was eat a chili. Their tongues must be burning from the spiciness. They'll be just fine after drinking a few cups of cold water." After finishing her explanation, Chu Lian couldn't help but burst out into laughter. Senior servant Gue relaxed after hearing this. However, she shot a weird look at her young madam, who had been so mischievous as to prank the younger girls. Senior servant Zhong turned around and quickly instructed some other maidservants to fetch cold water for the girls in the kitchen to drink. When the younger maidservants returned, their eyes were red and full of tears. They shot pathetic looks at Chu Lian like they had been bullied. TL note, I can't stand spicy food myself, so I feel for the maidservants. Thanks to Chu Lian's craving for spicy dishes, here's a mega load of hot food: porn, dried chili peppers, chili oil, spicy spring chicken, boiled mutton, sour and spicy soup, fried spicy shredded beef, mapo tofu. Chapter 148, Poached Fish Slices, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian purposely kept her expression straight, scolding them, "Let's see if you'll dare to eat before thinking the next time. If you ever do something wrong, the punishment from now on will be to eat a whole bowl of these chilies." The younger maidservants quickly bowed their heads, not daring to make a peep. Even the expressions of senior servants Gue and Zhong instantly turned serious. Actually, Chu Lian had phrased her words like this on purpose. 2 days ago, For his Sanlang's package, Xian and the rest had taken her snacks and senior servant Gui had taken her wine without asking for her permission. Furthermore, ever since they had started cooking their own food to eat, since her recipes were so good, there would be some food missing from time to time. Chu Lian had only pretended not to notice, but recently, they had started overstepping their bounds too much. Although Xian and senior servant Gui had been acting on her behalf when giving away her snacks and wine for his Sanlang's package, they had to have rules in place. She was the actual mistress of Songtao Court, after all, and that was only within this courtyard. Outside was still the hierarchy of the larger Jing'an estate. It might be a small matter to take some food, but she couldn't let bad habits like this fester. Letting it pass would eventually lead to the servants becoming bolder and greedier. Chu Lian took this chance to knock some sense back into the servants of her courtyard, clearly asserting her stance. She was going to punish anyone who overstepped their bounds again, and even senior servant Gui was not exempt from this rule. Chu Lian's eyes swept over the gathered servants. After sensing that her warning had been taken seriously, she relaxed and her expression returned to her warm and friendly self. Fuyan, go and see if there's any fish in the kitchen today. Wenlan, Mingyan, bring out 2 more basins to keep these chillis. Jingyan, bring me some sesame, garlic, scallions, and ginger. After she finishing giving out orders, Chu Lian stood to one side and instructed the remaining handmaids on how to wash and chop the dried chillis. For the entire afternoon, Songtao Court was filled with a fragrant yet spicy aroma, making most of the people in the kitchen choke on the smell. Chu Lian got Xian to move out one of the wooden chairs to a spot under some wisteria plants. She held Gillen Restaurant's account book in her hands and made markings from time to time, all the while keeping an eye on the servants bustling around the lively kitchen. When she held her hand out, Xian quickly passed a delicate dish over, filled with little pieces of bitter gourd with toothpicks sticking out of them. Chu Lian picked up one of the pieces with a toothpick and felt refreshed. When Xian noticed her change in expression, she hurried forward to help massage Chu Lian's shoulders. Chu Lian would speak up every few moments, a little more to the left. And Xian would follow her orders. Chu Lian closed her eyes and relaxed. This was the ideal layabout's life for her. Not long after, Fuyan and the rest walked in covered with the smell of grease and smoke. Their faces were flushed red from the heat and exertion. When they reached Chu Lian's side, they were coughing non-stop. Chu Lian purposely coughed into her fist and asked, "Is it all done?" Replying to third young madam, "The chili oil has been prepared according to your instructions. There are about 2 jars worth of oil in total. Once it has cooled down, we can pour it into the jars." Jingyan replied. "Since it's done, go back to your rooms to bathe and change. Wash off that smell on you." The maidservants acted like they had just been given amnesty and fled. Satisfied, Chu Lian ate another piece of bitter gourd. "Xian, have you taken a good look? This is the fate of anyone who dares to steal my food for the benefit of others. Don't worry, I still have sacks and sacks of chili left." Xian was scared stiff by Chu Lian's words. She tried to stay strong, but she couldn't hold it back in the end. "Third young madam, this servant will not dare to touch your belongings without your permission in the future. Third young madam, please have mercy on this servant this one time." Chu Lian cast a glance at Xian. "Xian, it's good that you understand. I hope you won't lose something bigger for the sake of a small gain." Although it wasn't easy to make those snacks, they were just something to fulfill a craving. Chu Lian wanted to use this opportunity to remind Xian that she had to protect whatever was entrusted to her safekeeping. If she were to make the same mistake again, there were punishments awaiting her. Chapter 149, Poached Fish Slices, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. For the evening meal, Chu Lian personally cooked up some poached fish slices and a pot of sour and spicy soup. The rest of the dishes were what they normally had here in Songtao Court. The snow-white poached fish slices were placed on top of a fresh pile of bean sprouts, with bright red chilies scattered on top. When the slices were served, it was a feast for the eyes. The fish meat was soft and tender. Although there was a layer of chilies on it, it wasn't too spicy. Once that thin slice of fish entered her mouth, Chu Lian shut her eyes in pleasure as the corners of her lips lifted up. It was just a pity she was eating alone. A dish like this felt more magnificent when it was served up in a huge plate. However, since it was just her, she told Xian to put the fish in a small bowl. For the remainder of it, Chu Lian ordered Xian to split it into 2 portions and send them to Qingxi Hall and the main branch's courtyard. Senior servant Gui personally delivered the portion for Qingxi Hall and was received by senior servant Liu. This is a new dish that third young madam made today. This old servant was sent under third young madam's orders to bring some over for the matriarch to have a taste. However, third young madam also has a reminder. These poached fish slices are a little spicy, so if the spiciness is too much for the matriarch, a small taste will do. Senior servant Liu smiled and acknowledged the message. She received the dish and passed it to the maidservant behind her to send to matriarch He. Next, senior servant Luke personally escorted senior servant Gui out of the courtyard. Over at Dalong's courtyard, they also received their share of the poached fish slices. It just so happened that He Changqi was present. He Changqi opened the lid of the container, only to see a layer of red chilies on top. He exclaimed in surprise, "Is this made from those chilies I brought back this afternoon?" Replying to Jing'an, "It is. Our third young madam personally cooked this dish, and has a message. If these poached fish slices are too spicy, please don't eat too much of it. Since it's made from those chilies, I have to taste this properly." Before Xian had even left, He Changqi had already ordered the senior servants in his courtyard to start serving the evening meal. He clearly couldn't wait to taste what a dish made from these chilies would be like. The next day, when Chu Lian arrived at Qingxi Hall for her usual morning greetings, she bumped into her eldest brother-in-law, He Changqi. The matriarch smiled and let Chu Lian sit by her side, joking, "Your eldest brother specially waited for 20 minutes more for you to come over." Chu Lian found it strange, so she asked, "Eldest brother-in-law, is anything the matter?" He Changqi's broad, tan face seemed to flush a little as he pressed his lips together, too embarrassed to speak up. He could only turn to matriarch He for help. "Look at you, it's just a small matter and it's gotten you so flustered you can't even speak. Samlang's wife married into our family, so you're her older brother now." Matriarch He pretended to scold He Changqi before taking Chu Lian's hand into her own and smiling. "Your eldest brother has some friends coming over as guests in 2 more days. After eating those poached fish slices you sent over last night, he thought that your cooking was delicious. Thus, he wanted to ask if you could help cook a meal to impress them." When inviting guests over, the host always had to have either fine food or fine wine prepared. Since secret recipes were regarded so preciously in this time, each estate always had at most 1 or 2 signature dishes to bring out for their guests. Previously, House Jing'an had Cook Show's confections as their specialty. Now that Cook Show had passed, He Dalong felt that he didn't have any good food to impress his friends with, so he continued to delay the meal he owed them time after time. Now that he had this chance, he couldn't let it go. Chu Lian had thought that it would be something hard for her. If it was just adding 1 or 2 dishes for her eldest brother-in-law's guests, then that would be extremely easy. Chu Lian immediately nodded and agreed to the request. Dalong had finally gotten rid of the one thing weighing on his mind and was about to leave when senior servant Liu rushed in from outside. "Matriarch, the outer court steward just sent over some news. There's someone from the palace requesting an audience." TL note, these pics look so good. Poached fish slices with chili, a closer look. Chapter 150, Honored Lady, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Someone from the palace. Matriarch He and He Changchi exchanged confused gazes the moment they heard this news. The master of the estate was away at the border, and their heir only had a minor position at court. A family like theirs wouldn't usually get visitors from the palace. Even if Matriarch He were to send her token to the palace to request a visit, they would have to wait days for a reply, even though the matriarch was close friends with the Empress Dowager. Upon seeing their surprised faces, senior servant Lu quickly added a few more details. The steward said that it's one of the high-ranked eunuchs from the inner chambers. He's here to read out an imperial decree that he brought along with him. What? An imperial decree? This was even more startling to them. None of the masters of House Jing'an had ever done something worthy of getting an imperial decree. Although they were still extremely confused, Matriarch He sent the news out to all the masters of each courtyard, ordering them to gather in the parlor at the outer court to await the announcement of the imperial decree. In a short moment, the entire He family was kneeling on the floor inside the parlor. Chu Lian knelt behind Madame Zhou, according to rank. She lifted her head a little so she could see what happened next. The high-ranked eunuch cast a swift glance over the gathered crowd before he straightened, adjusted his sleeves, and took up the yellow imperial decree from a tray held by a lower-ranked eunuch. His sharp voice began to read. By order from the heavens, as decreed by His Majesty, Madame Chu, the wife of House Jing'an's third son, He Changdi, has been recognized for her praiseworthy and beautiful spirit, peaceful and pure demeanor, as well as her quick wits and vast intelligence. Our great emperor, by his benevolence, hereby bestows upon Madame Chu the fifth-ranked title of Honored Lady, and grants the name Genie. Even before the eunuch finished, that one line was enough to stun everyone present. Even the old matriarch He, who had experienced more of the world, was staring with her eyes slightly widened. What was going on? How had Sanlang's wife acquired the title of Honored Lady in the blink of an eye? Even Chu Lian herself was in disbelief. Suddenly, she remembered what Royal Princess Duanjia had said to her back in Prince Wei's estate. Just you wait, I'll get you a noble title later on. It seemed like this sudden bestowal of a noble title definitely had something to do with Royal Princess Duanjia. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She thought that the princess had just been joking. Who could have expected that she had really gotten her a ranked noble title? Although it was the lowest-ranked honored lady, it was bestowed upon her directly by the emperor. That kind of honor meant that she had far more clout compared to any feudal princess. Madame Zhou, who was kneeling in front of Chu Lian, was completely dumbfounded. She subconsciously glanced over her shoulder, as if there was still a chance that her sister-in-law was a different Chu Lian than the one being mentioned in the imperial decree. She only peeked a little before turning back around. However, what she saw didn't please her. Her hands were already clenched into two tight fists. An uncontrollable amount of envy and jealousy flooded her mind. Third sister-in-law had gotten such a great honor simply by going to Prince Wei's estate. If she had known earlier about it, she would have surely followed along with third sister-in-law when she went to Prince Wei's estate. Perhaps then she would be the one mentioned in this imperial decree, rather than Chu Lian. This honored lady title personally bestowed by the emperor would have been hers. After building a strong connection with Prince Wei's estate, even if she could no longer produce any more children, Dalong wouldn't be allowed to take any concubines. Though Chu Lian was kneeling behind Madame Zhou, she could sense that something wasn't quite right with her eldest sister-in-law's emotional state. However, she was unable to observe her and figure out why. She could only guess at the thoughts running through Madame Zhou's head right now. When the high-ranked eunuch had finished reading the imperial decree, he lifted the scroll with both hands and a wide smile. Honored Lady Genie, please rise and receive the decree. Shi Yan quickly helped Chu Lian stand up, and Chu Lian walked up to the front of the crowd. She then received the yellow imperial decree from the high-ranked eunuch with both hands. We've troubled you. Chapter 151, Honored Lady, 2. The high-ranked eunuch carefully looked over this newly minted Honored Lady genie. A hint of befuddlement entered his eyes. He hadn't expected that this Honored Lady genie would be so young. She looked like she had just recently come of age. Honored Lady genie wasn't wearing even a speck of powder on her natural, lovely face. When she smiled, it felt like a warming spring breeze. She rated highly just on her looks alone, and seemed particularly matching with Yi Sanlang the Fair. By this time, matriarchy had been supported to her feet by some servants. She shot a look at Senior Servant Lu behind her, and Senior Servant Lu brought out a deep blue purse from her sleeve, passing it over to the high-ranked eunuch who had announced the good news. The eunuch smiled and accepted it. Matriarchy started to exchange pleasantries with the high-ranked eunuch. It turned out that this high-ranked eunuch had served by the Empress Dowager's side before, so matriarchy had seen him once or twice while visiting the Dowager. It was at this moment that a younger eunuch walked out from behind the high-ranked eunuch and slightly bowed towards Chu Lian. This servant greets Honored Lady Genie. Chu Lian's brows were slightly furrowed as she turned to look at this young eunuch. He was tall and slender with a high nose bridge. While his facial features were handsome on their own, when placed together on his face, it just seemed a little off. While the eunuch's words were full of respect, Chu Lian could see the disdain he held in his eyes. May I ask what business you have with me? The corner of the eunuch's lips curled up. However, his features weren't softened by the smile. Conversely, his expression looked even more sinister and wretched. Replying to Honored Lady Genie. This servant works in Yonghe Hall, and this servant heard that the Imperial Princess accidentally left behind a golden qilin here with Honored Lady Genie. Yonghe Hall. That was the name of a certain hall in the palace and the residence of Imperial Concubine Wei, who just so happened to be Imperial Princess Leo's mother. A shadow passed over Chu Lian's eyes. She had expected Imperial Princess Leo to send someone to demand that golden qilin back, but she really hadn't thought that the princess would resort to such a shameless tactic. She was trying to use the name of Yonghe Hall to pressure her. She wondered if Imperial Princess Leo was overestimating or underestimating her with this move. As long as Yi Changdi was her husband, she wouldn't be fussed with playing nice with Imperial Princess Leo. She had already offended the princess anyway. It didn't matter if she acquiesced or not now, the end result would be the same. If so, why bother giving in to the bullying? If the dear princess wanted her precious treasure back, she would have to pay the price first. Chu Lian sneered in her mind. Oh. Did something like that happen? How come I don't remember? Gong Gong, your memory doesn't seem to be working too well. Is your age catching up to you? Although Chu Lian's expression seemed friendly on the surface, her words didn't leave a single shred of mercy for the eunuch. Although the eunuch wasn't old and could even be deemed young, from the perspective of a young lady like Chu Lian who had just come of age, he was definitely much, much older. The eunuch flushed red in anger. As someone working in Yonghe Hall, even in the palace, excluding the servants of the Emperor and Empress Dowager, not many people dared to offend him. His face was a little contorted as he gritted his teeth and spoke, his words dropping from his mouth like stones. Is Honored Lady Genie sure that she doesn't remember? You should think carefully. It won't be good if you offend the Imperial Concubine and Princess, right? Chu Lian wasn't afraid of him at all. Anyway, she didn't any reason to enter the palace. Even if Imperial Concubine Wei and Imperial Princess Liao wanted to take out their anger on her, they had to come out of the palace first. TL note, Gong Gong is how eunuchs are addressed. I couldn't find a good and sensible English translation for this, so I kept it in its original form. Chapter 152, Honored Lady, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Oh my. Perhaps Gonggong needs a reminder. I've only met Imperial Princess Liao once at the Dingyuan estate. If Imperial Princess Liao lost something, then it should be in the Dingyuan estate. Gonggong, this is the Jingyan estate. When you came in through the entrance, did you not see the signboard above the doors? The eunuch was close to bursting due to anger. This was the first time that using the names of Imperial Concubine Wei and Imperial Princess Liao hadn't worked. Chu Lian was warning him that Imperial Princess Liao had lost the golden qilin to her. She had to accept her loss if she was willing to use it as a bet in the first place. If she wanted her treasure back, she had to give up something in exchange. This eunuch had just tried to falsely charge her with the crime of taking Imperial Princess Liao's treasure. However, that bet had been carried out under the eyes of everyone at the Dingyuan estate. If it were to get out that Imperial Princess Liao had forcibly demanded her wager back, then it would reflect badly on the princess herself. The eunuch held back his rage and instead, tried a different approach. He humbled himself and took out a plain purse from within his sleeve, holding it up with two hands as he tried to pass it over to Chu Lian. Honored lady, this is a gift that Imperial Concubine Wei entrusted to me, for the sake of exchanging for the princess's golden qilin. Chu Lian sent a look to Shi Yin, who quickly returned to Songtao Court to retrieve the golden qilin. Chu Lian had a spark of realization. She didn't really need to be too courteous with this eunuch after all. She took the purse directly and opened it to peek inside before she smiled and said, Gonggong, rest assured. Although it's something that the princess lost to me, I've kept it in good condition all this time. I'll pass it to you in front of everyone here today, so please look after it properly, Gonggong. Shi Yin returned quickly with the qilin. The young eunuch took the brocade box from Shi Yin's hands. He then opened it and looked over the contents carefully. After making sure that it was indeed Imperial Princess Liao's golden qilin, he bowed and said, This servant has troubled Honored Lady Jeannie today. This servant hopes Honored Lady Jeannie hasn't taken offense. After the people from the palace had departed, Chu Lian was called to Qingxi Hall by Matriarch He. She only came out of Qingxi Hall about an hour later. On the way back to Songtao Court, Chu Lian thought about what Matriarch He had said to her as she felt a headache about to come on. So she still had to enter the palace to give her thanks for the title bestowed upon her. When she realized that she might even bump into Imperial Princess Liao and Imperial Concubine Wei while at the palace, Chu Lian fell into a slight depression. Were the heavens against her somehow? Shi Yin followed after Chu Lian and was frowning as she thought of the events this morning. She couldn't resist asking, Third young madam, why did you have to say those words after passing that golden qilin over to the eunuch just now? Those words. Oh, right, her reminder to the eunuch to check the golden qilin. Chu Lian turned around and poked Shi Yin on the forehead. Why, you haven't figured it out yet. Shi Yin replied with a dazed, oh. Chu Lian sighed. Couldn't you tell that the intimidation at the start was all a ploy by that eunuch? Otherwise, how could he have taken out that purse full of banknotes later on? Imperial Princess Liao and Imperial Concubine Wei might not really like her, but as members of the Imperial family, if they wanted to take something back, they wouldn't be so shameless as to come empty-handed. Imperial Concubine Wei was of such high status that it would be beneath her to deal with a mere honored lady in such a shameless manner. The eunuch had been given those banknotes to buy back the golden qilin, but he had probably gotten greedy and thought to keep the money. This was likely why he had tried to use the name of Yonghe Hall to threaten Chu Lian into giving the qilin back. How could he have known that Chu Lian wasn't going to be taken in by his empty threat at all? As for why she specially asked the eunuch to check over the golden qilin before leaving, she was afraid that he would do something to it and cause a misunderstanding between her and imperial concubine Wei for revenge. Though he might not be able to do that anymore, she had definitely offended him today. That eunuch would probably add his own embellishments when he reported back to the imperial concubine and princess. There was a phrase that fit this situation perfectly well: it was better to offend a gentleman than a petty person. TL note, some shameless promotion of a bunch of sad short stories I translated a while back, http://valeronovels.com/ccu short stories/ these stories were all written by one author, with sad themes. We have a bird who wants to become human, a woman who waits for her lover to reincarnate, and a child talking about how she hates her mother. Give them a try. 3. Chapter 153, Letters from Home, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. However, even if Chu Lian hadn't accepted the money today, the eunuch probably would have looked down on her anyway. Either action would have led to the same result, so why not let him know that she wasn't someone he could bully? Even if he wanted to play his sneaky tricks on her next time, he would think twice before trying it again. Chu Lian's words made Xian come to a sudden realization. So it wasn't such a simple event after all. There were all these unseen twists in the middle of it. Chu Lian was a little down now. Anyone else would be pretty happy after getting a noble title, but she wasn't the slightest bit elated. Conversely, she was deep in worry. Who would want this honored lady title? Royal Princess Duanjia had done her a disservice with this move. What Chu Lian didn't know was that this surprise gift hadn't come about with just the efforts of Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia. Prince Jean had also helped out in getting her this title. When she returned to Songtao Court and saw the parlor full of gifts from the bestowal of her honored lady title, she waved her hands and had senior servants Gui and Zhong take care of it. Although she hadn't been given an accompanying medal or token of immunity along with the noble title, the emperor had personally picked out a name for her. That honor meant that she could stand on par with any feudal princess now. An honored lady was given a set of appropriate dresses for court gatherings and their matching headdresses. Other than that, she had also been given a small estate in the capital, about 6 hectares of good farmland and 100 pieces of gold. These were all part of the standard awards for an honored lady. Other than the special name a genie, the emperor hadn't added on anything more. Chu Lian pointed at the headdresses and said a little helplessly, "Place those together with the phoenix tail hairpin that royal princess gave to me." Now that she had a noble title, she could wear the simplest phoenix tail hairpin and no one would say anything bad about her. Senior servant Gui held up a stack of court dresses. "Third young madam, why don't you try these on? If they don't fit, we have to adjust them as early as possible." Chu Lian had suffered a series of shocks and surprises this morning, so she wasn't in the mood to play dress-up. Furthermore, these court dresses were made out of cloud-pattern brocade and were extremely thick. If she tried them on, she would probably start sweating. "I'll try them tomorrow." Senior servant Gui could only put away the clothes. Chu Lian returned to her own little study and took out the purse that the eunuch had given her. She had only taken a short glance inside just now, and estimated that there was about 800 taels inside. After carefully counting, she realized that there were actually over 1,200 taels worth of banknotes inside. Imperial concubine Wei really didn't lack money at all. Exchanging that golden qilin had earned her quite the tidy sum. She handed the banknotes to Xian to keep safely together with the rest of her savings. Then, Chu Lian drank a bowl of sweet soup, had a quick bath, and settled down for a nap. Matriarch he gave senior servant Lu some instructions as she slowly savored a bowl of bird's nest soup. Send someone over to Dalong's wife and have her make 2 more outfits suitable for a 5th-ranked noble wife for Sanlang's wife. And also, have her make 2 more phoenix tail hairpins. Senior servant Lu voiced her acknowledgement of the orders, but didn't immediately send someone off to execute them. She stood by Matriarchy's side as if she had something to say but did not dare to speak up. Matriarchy cast a sideways glance at her. Why? Do you think this old woman isn't being fair to Dalong's wife? This old servant doesn't dare to question Madam. Matriarchy set down the jade bowl in her hands and said, Shangyun, I've given her enough time. Dalong can't go without a male heir. If Dalong's wife can't even hold herself together over this small matter, then how will she face the day that Dalong takes a concubine? Dalong will be the one to shoulder the responsibility of taking care of this family in the future. Upon hearing Matriarchy's words, Senior Servant Lu suppressed the concerns that she had wanted to bring up. She simply agreed with the matriarch and turned to do her bidding. When Madame Zhou received the news, she couldn't hold back her rage and immediately threw a teacup to the ground, scaring the trembling maidservant who had passed on the message. However, as angry as she was, she couldn't disobey Matriarchy's orders. She tried her best to suppress the fire in her heart. At night, when Dalong tried to initiate intimacy with her, she didn't have the mood to acquiesce. Although both husband and wife slept on the same bed, they had different thoughts in mind this night. Chapter 154, Letters from Home, 2. In the northern border at Liangzhou, the weather was growing colder since the start of August. While the nobles in the capital were still donning summer garments, the people in Liangzhou had to put on a thick coat to step outside. In the simple city of Liangzhou, there was an unassuming little courtyard with only 3 rooms and an open-air kitchen and a stack of freshly cut firewood next to that kitchen. There was still a small fire lit up on the range in the kitchen. White smoke was drifting upwards from the range while a strange smell was coming from the pot on the stove. At this moment, a person stood up from behind the range with a face full of soot. The entrance to the courtyard was pushed open with a creak, and a young man with a full beard stepped in. He was dressed in black with a sword at his waist. Although he seemed a little dusty and worn from his travels, there was a resolute light in his eyes. The soot-faced man quickly ran over to welcome his master. "Third young master, you're finally back. Quick, come into the room to rest. The meal will be done soon." Liyue took the package off He Changdis' back and the long sword at his waist before leading his master into the main room. This was He Changdis' 10th day in Liangzhou. This courtyard that he was staying in had been bought just 10 days ago. He Changdi was now darker than when he first entered Liangzhou. The elegant line of his chin had been completely obscured by a dense beard, but his originally deep eyes had become even more spirited and determined. He had been running all over the city these few days and slimmed down quite a bit. However, his body had become more toned with muscle. If He Sanlang the Fair could be compared to a handsome, tall bamboo tree previously, then the current He Sanlang was now a tall and straight pine standing by a cliff. When Liyue saw the dust covering his master, he felt heartache for his master's plight. He served up tea and water before saying, "Young master, rest here in this room for now. This servant will get you some good food to eat." He Sanlang was indeed a little tired by now. He washed his face and hands before resting on a bamboo chair with his eyes closed. It wasn't until a strange smell seeped into the room that He Changdi opened his narrow eyes and looked towards the table. "What is this?" Liyue cast a guilty glance at the food on the table and said, "Young master, it's porridge." The corner of He Sanlang's eyes twitched. Could that white and yellow slop with pieces of wheat bran mixed in between be called porridge? It was bad enough that the appearance was so strange. However, there was also a weird smell accompanying this porridge. Liyue showed a suffering expression. "Young master, you know that this servant doesn't know how to cook. However, there's also a limit to the food available here in Liangzhou, so this is the best this servant could do. What Liyue didn't say was that they didn't have much money left on them and it wasn't enough to buy any good ingredients at all. Polished rice cost 1,000 coins per kilogram back at the capital. Out here at the border, polished rice cost 10 taels of silver per kilogram. It was bad enough that it was so expensive, but commoners weren't allowed to buy polished rice even if they had the money to do so. Liangzhou had been embroiled in tussles over the border for years and wasn't well maintained. How could the quality of life here be any good? Since there was a shortage of goods, when Liyue had gone shopping earlier today, he had only been able to buy some millet, sorghum and wheat bran. He couldn't even find any fresh vegetables, fruits, or even wild-caught meat. There was only a single place selling alcohol in this bleak and desolate place. The alcohol was simply some watered-down low-quality wine. TL note, guessing that Liyue's porridge might have looked something like this. XD Liyue's porridge. Chapter 155, Letters from Home, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Since there was a shortage of goods, when Liyue had gone shopping earlier today, he had only been able to buy some millet, sorghum, and wheat bran. He couldn't even find any fresh vegetables, fruits, or even wild-caught meat. There was only a single place selling alcohol in this bleak and desolate place. The alcohol was simply some watered-down low-quality wine. Liyue had never needed to cook while serving his young master before. His culinary skills were close to non-existent. Making something edible was already a commendable feat for him. There were monthly raids by the Tuhun soldiers here and the whole city was almost empty. They were indeed in dire straits. He Changdi glared fiercely at Liyue. This manservant was way too useless, how could he be even more pampered than his own master? Liyue's legs turned to jelly under that intense stare. He had to summon up enough courage to say, "Young master, if you think that my cooking is bad, then why don't I buy back a maidservant for you tomorrow?" There were plenty of poor families forced to sell their sons and daughters to survive in this city. It was quite cheap to buy a girl to cook and clean for you. He Changdi took up the wooden chopsticks at the side and harumphed. Buying a maidservant? Are you going to raise her then? After hearing He Changdi's words, Liyue immediately shut up. Although it was only a single maidservant, he couldn't afford to keep her. He had to eat and drink. The money they brought was barely enough for the two of them as it was. Too lazy to continue talking to this useless manservant of his, He Changdi held his bowl in hand and took a sip with his brows furrowed. As expected, this porridge tasted as bad as it smelled. Even the Chinese olive porridge made by the barbarians was better. For the sake of keeping his body fueled, He Changdi forced himself to drink down the entire bowl. It wasn't the time to be picky. After the morning market in Liangzhou closed, there were barely any street stalls or shops open. Even if they wanted to eat something better, they didn't have the money for it. Liyue drank down a bowl of porridge with a bitter expression. When he was done, he stared at the empty bowl before him with a blank expression and began talking to himself. If only third young madam were here. Even the lousiest ingredients become heavenly dishes in her hands. As he daydreamed about a heaping bowl of braised meat, Liyue felt that he had become even more of a glutton after these few months. What did you say? When He Changdi heard Liyue's mumbling, he abruptly turned his fearsome gaze onto his dazed manservant. Liyue shrunk back and quickly kept silent. He Sanlang glared at him again before standing up and leaving for his room. He had been out the whole day and was really tired by now. Lying on the simple bed made of mud, He Changdi rested with one arm behind his head and one arm on his chest. Perhaps due to Liyue's words, what flashed through his mind wasn't the anger, regret, and hatred from his previous life, but the memory of Chu Lian having breakfast in the parlor of Songtao Court. Shrouded by the steam from the food, her face seemed to lack the perverse ruthlessness and eccentricity he had seen before, and she seemed like a totally different person from that wicked woman of his previous life. Even though their faces were exactly the same, he felt that they were completely different people. What in the world was going on? Could the allure of food be that great? So much so that it could change his mind towards someone so sinister and venomous. With an unsettled heart, he shut his eyes before opening again. His thoughts returned to those few meals he had had in Songtao Court. He realized that that wicked woman could use even the most simplest of ingredients to cook up a tasty meal. Those wontons and scallion pancakes he had the other day were just made of flour, vegetables, and some meat. If Chu Lian were here by his side now, what culinary delights could she make with the millet, sorghum, and wheat bran? No matter what, it would surely be delicious. When he realized where his thoughts had led him, Changdi's slender body abruptly froze up. His expression turned ugly and gloomy. He rubbed his temples in frustration. It must have been his fatigue, coupled with Liu's words. Otherwise, how could he be missing that wicked woman who had condemned him to a life not worth living? Sometimes, it wasn't good to keep talking about others. While San Lang was regretting his thoughts and trying to force himself to sleep, a series of furious knocks at the door interrupted him. Young master, young master. The estate sent some letters for you. Liu excitedly exclaimed. Chapter 156, Reading Letters from Home, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Changdi immediately stood up and opened the door. The moment he entered the courtyard, he spotted a middle-aged man dressed as a merchant standing in the middle of the open space, carrying a huge bag on his back. After Changdi took the package from him, the man gave a salute and quickly left. When Liu saw that his master seemed to be so distracted by his own thoughts that he had yet to open the bag, he helpfully reminded, "Young master, quick, open it and see what's inside." Changdi walked back into the house and placed the bag on top of the table. He gently loosened the strings tying the sack closed and opened it, peeking at the contents inside. The bag had been stuffed full to the brim, and the topmost layer was made up of autumn clothes. These clothes were not the unlined long gowns normally worn by the nobles in the capital. Instead, they were short and made of the most common fabric. For outerwear, there was only a single cloak made of 2 separate pieces. For innerwear, there were a few more sets of inner clothes, as well as socks. These were also made of much higher quality material, since no one would be able to notice them when they were worn on the inside. Other than that, there was also a pair of deerskin boots. They were perfect for this weather, since deerskin was hardy and waterproof. A light flashed in San Lang's eyes as he took in the sight of them all. Liu was happy for his master as he looked over all the clothes. He heaped on generous praise as he said, "Third young madam is so considerate. The things she sent are all what young master needs most right now." Chu Lian had done some backpacking before back in the modern world, so she knew what was most needed when out in the wild. Although she had gotten senior servant Gui and Xian to pack things for her, she had looked over the contents and taken out all the useless things like unlined long gowns, fans, and jade amulets. She had changed them out for socks, inner clothes, short gowns, gloves, and so on. They had left in a hurry and in secret, so they didn't bring much with them. The pair of shoes on Changdi's feet had already been worn out in a few places. It was about time for him to switch to a new pair. The letters were squashed by the clothes inside, so Changdi carefully pulled out the fragile papers. When Liu noticed the especially huge envelope within, he exclaimed loudly, "Third young madam wrote such a thick letter." After saying so, he chuckled with a silly grin directed at his master. San Lang cast a sideways glance at Liu and didn't open Chu Lian's letter in front of him. Instead, he carefully placed it off to one side. There was a smaller package in a corner of the bag. Changdi pulled the smaller package out and opened it up. Inside was a gourd, some small jars and a few exquisite cloth bags. While finding it strange, he picked up the gourd and gently uncorked it. Instantly, a fragrant, refreshing aroma came drifting out of the gourd. Layue's nose was sharper, as he normally drank quite a lot while out with his young master. He hadn't had a drop of wine in months, so the moment he detected the scent of alcohol in the air, his eyes sparkled. "Young master, this is wine." Sanlang's eyes glimmered for a moment before he gave a light snort and quickly corked the gourd again. He put it off to the one side that Layue couldn't reach, like he was protecting a little chick from a big bad wolf. Following that, Sanlang purposely put on a calm facade while opening one of the exquisitely made cloth bags. When the blue bag was opened, the smell of something delicious mixed together with spices permeated the air. Sanlang cast a measuring gaze over the rest of the bags. He seemed lost in a daze for a moment. Layue was dying of curiosity. He moved closer to his young master and asked in a light tone, filled with expectation, "Young master, what's in this cloth bag? Is it food?" Changdi was brought back to the real world by Layue's words. The corners of his mouth twitched. He looked over the bags and picked the smallest one out. With an unwilling expression, he tossed it over to Layue before he swiped the rest along with the package and retreated into his own room. Layue was someone who was extremely easy to satisfy. When he received the cloth bag, he couldn't wait and immediately opened it up. He walked over to the door and used the dim light of the evening to look inside before taking a long sniff at it. After confirming that the bag contained jerky, he was delighted. He quickly took out a piece as big as half his palm and bit into it. His mouth chewed at top speed. It was so good that tears almost leaked out from his eyes. Chapter 157, Reading Letters from Home, 2. After using a bag of pork jerky to keep that gluttonous Layue away, Changdi was finally able to enjoy some peace and quiet in his room. He gently placed the bag of snacks off to the side before sitting down by his desk and taking out his letters. He read the letters from Matriarch He and his eldest brother Changchi first, then those from Countess Jingan and his best friend Prince Jin. When he noticed that every family member had sung praises of Chu Lian, for the first time, Changdi wasn't filled with contempt. He gripped the letters in hand, lowered his gaze, and pursed his lips, seemingly lost in thought. After being distracted for a good while, Changdi put the letters from his family aside and opened the letter from Prince Jin. However, the moment he read Prince Jin's 2-page letter, the hard-won sliver of guilt and bafflement from before vanished into thin air, without leaving a single speck behind. Chu Lian. That wicked woman. How dare she? So it was true. It was easier to move mountains and rivers than change a person's nature. He had truly been too naive, thinking that she had actually turned over a new leaf just because she was a bit different from the previous lifetime. Who would have thought that? Humph. So a leopard really couldn't change its spots. Xiao Bojian, Chu Lian. One day. Hell make that cheating couple pay. By the time Sanlang recovered from his episode of overwhelming hatred, Prince Jin's letter was all crumpled up into a ball. When he released his grip on it, the bits of torn paper slipped between his fingertips and scattered, just like snow. Sanlang leaned back against the chair and closed his grudge-filled eyes, only to open them a few moments later. His eyes had darkened, and his aura also changed, becoming colder and stern. Sanlang's gaze lowered, locking onto the huge leather envelope on the table. The sight of it now conjured a sense of ridicule instead of warmth. An icy, mocking snort slipped out from between his lips. Sanlang reached out and tore open the massive envelope with his long, nimble fingers. Although his face was still cold and stern, his slightly trembling fingers exposed his true feelings. His heart was filled with hatred, but his fingers still moved to open the envelope, almost against his own will. He pulled out a thick stack of papers from inside. In his past life, that wicked woman had never written a single letter to him, so he rarely got to see her handwriting. With that, it could be assumed that he, her legal husband, didn't even have a place in her wicked heart. When he opened the letter and saw the simple drawings on the very first page, Sanlang was stunned. His almond-shaped eyes flickered with uncertainty, and he quickly flipped through the next few pages. Damn it! Just like the first page, they were all drawings. Every single one of them. There wasn't a single written word. Despite the simplicity of the artwork, a vivid, lively scene was presented with just a few brush strokes. But no matter how innocent the picture, Sanlang still wasn't able to contain the rage swirling inside his chest. He slammed his fist against the table, causing the paperweight on the table to flip over twice. Sanlang felt that all the letters he sent to provoke Chu Lien had been completely ignored. His anger was all pent up in his chest, and it was obviously a difficult thing to bear. He got up and paced around the room to try and suppress the raging anger and frustration he felt inside. A long while later, Sanlang gradually calmed down. He once again returned to his desk. When his gaze landed on the stack of drawings, Sanlang sneered. It had been months since they last met, and that wicked woman was getting better and better at acting. A mere stack of drawings had given the whole family a favorable impression of her. They probably thought that the envelope contained thousands upon thousands of words of longing as deep as an endless sea, as if by writing them she wanted to send the entirety of herself over to him. If he hadn't opened it himself, perhaps he would have been fooled by that wicked woman as well. Chapter 158, Reading Letters from Home, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. After taking a few deep breaths, Sanlang once again suppressed the endless waves of anger rising from within him. Once he was calm enough, he picked up the drawings once again and took a proper look at them. But now that he was giving them a good look, Sanlang actually became completely immersed in them. The drawings in Chu Lien's letter were similar to the 4-box manga style of the modern age. Although she didn't include a single word in there, it managed to do a fine job at narrating and expressing exactly what she wanted to. The lack of words didn't have any negative impact on conveying the content. In the drawing, the cutely drawn female lead was Chu Lien herself. On every page, the little girl had different expressions and actions. Sometimes she was angry, sometimes haughty, and sometimes sincere. The expressions and emotions given to the little girl were all lively and fresh. Despite the art's simplicity, it was attractive, and appealed to people in a way that drew others closer to the artist. Actually, there was a reason why Chu Lien had made these comics instead of just writing a reply. She was afraid that she would be exposed by her handwriting, so she had no choice but to draw instead. The contents of the drawings were also quite random. Perhaps due to her professional habits from her previous life, she subconsciously drew each of them with a theme. The comics were all centered around interesting things that happened in her daily life. A single picture could convey more than 1,000 words, and was far more intuitive to understand. Moreover, a manga style like this hadn't appeared in the Great Wu Dynasty before. Looking at these drawings, Changdi felt like he could envision Chu Lien's everyday life. The lively, happy-go-lucky girl in these drawings deviated greatly from the personality of the insidious, deceitful, wicked woman that he knew her as. A short while later, he abruptly opened his eyes. He hated that he had unwittingly had a change of heart once again. Sanlang took a deep breath to suppress the strange feeling before his deep gaze landed on the final drawing. In that drawing, a little girl who had her hair tied up in a bun sat on a chair, facing a kind, middle-aged lady. The two were happily chatting away. The middle-aged lady had a benevolent smile, but there was a red patch on the left cheek of her slightly plump, round face. There was also a servant pouring some tea for her. The little girl with the bun had a thought bubble floating on top of her head. There wasn't a word in it, but there was a remarkably detailed portrait of a noble lady with white hair. The noble lady had a kind face, but it wasn't very recognizable. The most notable aspect of her was the phoenix headdress on top of her head, and this phoenix had 9 phoenix tails on it. The noble lady with white hair was smiling brightly with an aura of a saint, and her hand was drawn giving a thumbs up. It went without saying that the little girl with the bun was Chu Lien. That woman felt no shame in drawing herself so cutely. As for the background of the drawing, He Changdi only needed a second to recognize it. It was the Dingyuan estate. A middle-aged woman with a red patch on her face. Anyone in the capital would know that the northern border troops Captain Gua had an extremely ugly wife. However, Captain Gua had nothing but deep respect for his wife. Not only did he treat her as his equal, but he never even took a single concubine. They had 2 sons and 3 daughters together, and were well known in the capital as a couple. The identity of the noble lady in the bubble was even more obvious. It was the current Empress Dowager. There was a rule in the Great Wu dynasty that only the Empress Dowager was qualified to wear ornaments with 9 phoenix tails. Even the Empress was limited to just 7 phoenix tails. Chu Lien was happily chatting with Captain Gua's wife, while the Empress Dowager was happily showing her approval. What was that wicked woman trying to tell him? The northern border troops were under the command of the Duke of Lu, Great General Qian. Captain Gua was one of his subordinate officers. Although he didn't have the most important position amongst the general's men, he was still close to General Qian. The officers serving in the northern border troops all had actual authority. Captain Gua was brave and fierce, good in battle, and empathetic to the soldiers under his command. He was a great leader who protected his men, and didn't steal credit for deeds that weren't his. Although he had many good points to him, he was also hot-headed and impulsive. It was due to this fatal weakness that General Qian hadn't given him a more important post. TL note: some important changes in names. While translating this chapter, I realized that I made a mistake in translating the names of the dukes in this story. Chu Lian's maiden family is the House of Duke Ingwa, but it should actually be Duke Ing. I didn't realize that Gua is part of the title Duke in Chinese, as the other noble houses all had 2 Chinese characters in their names, i.e. Count Jing'an, Marquis Dingyuan etc. All the chapters before this have already been changed. Duke Ingwa - Duke Ing Duke Xingwa - Duke Xing. Chapter 159, Reading Letters from Home. 4. He Changdi wouldn't have known about all these military secrets had it not been for the fact that he'd lived it once already. If he threw his lot in with a leader like that and boosted Captain Gua's bravery with his own resourcefulness, General Qian would definitely notice the improvement in Captain Gua. Using that as a chance, he could then make himself known to the Duke of Lu and earn the opportunity to get into his graces. This was He Changdi's current plan for himself. During the past few days, he had kept himself busy coming and going in order to build connections with the northern border troops, all in the hopes of getting posted under Captain Gua. He hadn't mentioned a single word of these secrets to anyone, not even Prince Jean. However, that wicked woman had somehow had the same thoughts as him. He Sanlang had already confirmed that Chu Lien hadn't experienced the same past life that he had, so he was certain that Chu Lien didn't know how events would progress from now on. So why had she sent him a hint like that in such an obscure way? Was it her true love Xiao Wujing? Meanwhile, the sleeping Chu Lien back in Songtao court didn't know that her small gesture of kindness had caused the paranoid He Changdi to nearly pull his hair out over the various possibilities. Since she couldn't possibly be clairvoyant, and she hadn't been reincarnated, then He Changdi could only say that that wicked woman Chu Lien was sharper than he had initially thought. He hadn't expected that there was another layer of depth to her intelligence that she had kept secret, even throughout her previous life. All this mystery had erased any shred of gratitude he had ever felt towards her. On the contrary, his caution against her had increased by another level. If Chu Lian found out what chaos her drawings had caused, she would have definitely sprawled out on her bed and beat the mattress a few times with her fists. Please, my dear husband, how does your brain work? If a normal wife were to do such a helpful thing, shouldn't you be heaping praises on her and showering her with your love? How about a compliment or two about being smart and virtuous? Why are you doing the opposite? He Chengdi folded up the letter and put it back into the huge leather envelope. Following that, he took it and walked up to the fire burning in the brazier. With a wave of his hand, the envelope landed inside the brazier and was completely surrounded by flames. When he saw that the letter had caught fire, He Sanlang's eyes suddenly dimmed. He reached out at lightning-fast speed and pulled the envelope out of the fire. There was a flurry of activity as he put out the burning envelope. When He Sanlang saw the singed corner, the only evidence to his rash action, there was a strange feeling in his heart. The set of drawings tucked inside appeared in his mind. Had that wicked woman really just been trying to give him a hint? Perhaps the truth wasn't as dark as he thought. Thoughts as messy as the scattered grass of the plains ran through his head. Eventually, he tossed the singed envelope into a wooden box. Out of sight, out of mind. Chu Lian had practiced 2 pages of calligraphy in her little study. After destroying the evidence, she had gone to try on her new court dresses. Senior servant Gue recorded down any parts that hadn't fit in order to alter the dresses herself later. During her daily greetings, Chu Lian made a request to Matriarch He to pay a visit to Gillen Restaurant. She wanted to see for herself what state it was in. After finishing all the small tasks, Chu Lian changed into a plain blue dress and brought Wenlan and Wenqing along with her. She boarded the carriage that the estate had already prepared for her and left for Gillen Restaurant, accompanied only by a few manservants and guards. Gillen Restaurant was located in the Old West Market, which was rather far away from the Jingon estate. The alleys were small and twisty, so it took an hour before they arrived. Chapter 160, Incognito Visit to Gillen Restaurant. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had come down to make an incognito visit today, so she dressed very plainly. Even the carriage she took lacked the House Jing'an insignia. Together with the rest of the party, most people would just assume that she was the wife of a low-ranking official. Gillen Restaurant was situated deep in the Old West Market. Ever since the bounds of the West Market had been redrawn by the Ministry of Transport, this whole area had become a part of Anno Lane. Anno Lane was a housing district for civilian families. Back then, a majority of the shops here had been bought, and the land they stood on had been turned into small homes meant for commoners. Never mind the only restaurant, Gillen Restaurant was probably the only business left in the area. Although the ordinary folks on Anno Lane weren't poor, the number of families who could afford to eat at a restaurant wasn't enough. During this period, the cost of having a meal at a restaurant was equivalent to several sumptuous home-cooked meals of fish and meat. Gillen Restaurant didn't have a large customer base to begin with. To make matters worse, its food was so ordinary that it even fell short of the street food outside. Business was obviously very poor. If not for the special meaning this restaurant held to Matriarch He, it would have most likely closed down over 10 years ago. How could a business be allowed to continue operating at a loss? The carriage steadily rode along the alleyways on Anno Lane. It was close to noon, so there was smoke coming out from the chimneys of the houses on the street. There were kids playing in the open and adults carrying bamboo poles loaded with items as they walked by. They had faces full of sweat, but they carried bright and happy smiles. Chu Lian slightly lifted the carriage's curtain and took in the scene of how commoners of the Great Wu dynasty lived with her eyes wide open. It was so fresh and vivid that she couldn't take her eyes off it. She was completely immersed in this reality. When Wenqing noticed that Chu Lian was entranced with the view outside, she thought Chu Lian was running out of patience, so she said, "Third young madam, we're just 2 alleys away from Gillen Restaurant." Wenqing and Wenlan used to live in a manor together with senior servant Zhong. As Wenqing's home was close to Anna Lane, she was the most familiar with this area. She had also passed by Gillen Restaurant several times, but she had never gone in before. Chu Lian let down the blinds and took a sip of the honey water in the teacup before her. She tilted her head to one side and said, "When we reach Gillen Restaurant later, all of you are not to reveal my identity. Understand?" Although Wenqing and Wenlan were curious about the reason behind third young madam's order, they were smart enough not to question it. They nodded and agreed in unison. As expected, the gently shaking carriage reached the entrance to Gillen Restaurant in just a moment. Gillen Restaurant was situated at a bend in the corner of the street. In the original West Market, it was a great position, but after it became a residential area, the surrounding businesses closed one after another and Gillen Restaurant was the sole business that remained. There was a certain quaint charm to Anna Lane, but it was a pity that there was very little human traffic. The people who did pass by were mostly commoners who ate at home. Chu Lian got off the carriage with Wenqing supporting her. She raised her head slightly to take in the sight of Gillen Restaurant. Perhaps due to the uniform buildings of the West Market in the past, Gillen Restaurant's entrance wasn't that big, and it only had a single floor. The sandalwood signboard had the words Gillen Restaurant drawn on it with black ink, and the calligraphy looked bold and charismatic. It was inviting and gave off the feeling of being free with the wind. However, the signboard was also aged and mottled, with peeling paint all over, making the restaurant look decrepit. This was obviously due to the restaurant being poorly maintained. Chu Lian's gaze shifted from the signboard to the restaurant itself. It was close to noon, but the entrance of Gillen Restaurant was barren, devoid of any life except for a few small sparrows. No one was behind the counter either, but there was a short wooden stool next to it. A young man dressed in coarse fabric who looked about 15 or 16 was sitting on the stool. He was snoring in his sleep and drooling all over the counter. Seeing Gillen Restaurant in such a lazy state, Chu Lian furrowed her brows together. Wenqing was so angry that her expression turned grave. Chu Lian stepped forward and entered Gillen Restaurant. The sleeping young man didn't wake up, not even when she walked right up to him. Wenqing moved up and pushed him. The young man tilted over and finally woke up from his dreams with an abrupt start. "Who was it? Who pushed me?" Chapter 161, Incognito Visit to Gillen Restaurant, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Upon being woken from his nice nap, the young man raised his head and sent an angry glare to the people around him. When he noticed that it was an extremely young-looking madam with a couple of equally young maidservants, his expression turned timid for a moment. However, once he took a closer look and realized that they weren't dressed very richly, he regained his bravado. The waiter stood up and tossed a sideways look at Wenqing before brushing off the non-existent dust on his clothes. "What are you doing? Didn't you see that I was sleeping?" Wenqing frowned and stuck her hands on her hips before ranting back, "What was I doing? Aren't you running a restaurant here? We're here to eat, what else could we be doing here?" The young man grimaced, baring his teeth. He sent a sideways glance towards Chu Lian and her maidservants as he said, "Sorry, our restaurant isn't open today. The manager isn't around. Find somewhere else to eat at." "Ah. Not open." Wenqing sniffed the air and could clearly smell something cooking in the kitchen at the back of the restaurant. Their doors were wide open too, how could the restaurant be closed? Chu Lien stood to one side and remained silent. Her bright eyes looked over the waiter, and then inspected the main hall behind him. Wenqing secretly observed Chu Lien's expression. Seeing as her mistress had no other orders, she continued with her own line of questioning. What kind of business are you running here? Your doors are wide open, but you're chasing customers away. If you don't want to run this business, then why leave the entrance open? Just close your doors and restaurant altogether. The waiter was infuriated by Wenqing's words. He was the nephew of the manager here. Because of that connection, those working in Gillen restaurant all gave way to him. He had never suffered the brunt of a young girl's temper before, not like he was now. Thus, his temper flared up. Who are you to be criticizing the way we do business? Go and find out who owns this business, then you'll know better than to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Scram! The young waiter was not only treating his customers with disrespect, but even throwing an even bigger tantrum back at them. Chu Lien wandered into the main hall without bothering to deal with him, one corner of her lips curled up in amusement. The noise in the main hall had drawn the attention of the people further inside the restaurant. A moment later, a middle-aged voice resounded from the back, "It's almost time to eat." "Ah Kai, who are you talking to outside?" Chu Lien heard the voice first before she saw someone push aside the curtains leading to the back, revealing a middle-aged woman wearing a flowery indigo dress. The middle-aged woman had a long face and was slightly plump. Her eyes were so small that, when she smiled, they formed a single line. When she reached the main hall and spotted Chu Lien and her servant standing there, the middle-aged woman showed an expression of surprise. She stepped forward and put on a friendly smile. "May I ask what business this madam has with us?" Wenqing almost laughed despite her anger. This was a restaurant, why would anyone ask their customers what they were here for? Was this woman trying to make a joke? Chu Lien was too lazy to speak. She shot a look at Wenqing. Understanding her mistress' order, Wenqing turned around and walked 2 steps towards the entrance, pointing her slender finger at the signboard above their heads. "Isn't a Gillen restaurant written up there? You have the word restaurant written so boldly on the banners next to the door, too. Our madam is here to have a meal. Don't tell me that's not possible." The middle-aged woman felt embarrassed after getting talked to by Wenqing. She wanted to reject these guests, since they hadn't bought much from the West Market today. They had only prepared enough for the restaurant staff to eat. However, the few sturdy-looking manservants caught her attention. When she saw them respectfully bow to Chu Lien as they made their reports, her words caught in her throat. She pulled out another smile and politely said, "Our restaurant has been remiss in welcoming our guests. Ah Kai just started working here not long ago and he's not familiar with the rules. Please forgive him, madam. Please, come in." Chapter 162, Incognito Visit to Gillen Restaurant, 3. Chu Lien followed the woman to a table in the main hall. When she looked down at the table, she realized that there was a layer of dust on it. Wenqing quickly used a handkerchief to wipe away the dust before supporting Chu Lien as she sat down. Ah Kai had followed behind the middle-aged woman, and was currently sporting an extremely unwilling expression on that ordinary face of his. If the woman hadn't tugged his arm once, he probably would have thrown another tantrum. Wenqing noticed that there was dust on the teacups on the table as well. Seeing as there was dust everywhere, she didn't bother spending the effort to clean any more. She stood behind Chu Lien and asked, "I've heard that your restaurant has been open for quite a number of years. Our madam loves to eat good food. What signature dishes does your restaurant have to offer?" The middle-aged woman choked on the answer. Gillen restaurant hadn't been doing business for quite a few months already. The cooks here had quit long ago, how could they possibly have any signature dishes to serve? The woman thought for a bit before replying, this young lady must be very knowledgeable. Our restaurant has indeed been open for many years. We have a few signature dishes, of course. Otherwise, how else could we have remained here for so long? Wenqing inwardly snorted, but didn't show a speck of her disdain on her face. She still remembered Chu Lian's orders back in the carriage. Oh. Since you have some signature dishes, then list out their names for our madam. Our madam has eaten dishes from all over this country, and she's had her fair share of delicacies. The woman hadn't expected Wenqing to be so thorough with her questioning. Her expression instantly stiffened. There weren't any cooks at all in Gillen restaurant right now. How could they possibly know the names of the commonly served special dishes? Seeing that Akai wanted to step up and throw the guests out, the woman grabbed his arm and tried to discreetly hold him back. Her eyes darted about the room as she tried to come up with a solution, but upon seeing none, she quickly tossed out another smile and said, "Young madam, I'm afraid I'm too uneducated and don't know the proper names for all those fancy dishes. Why don't I go back to the kitchen, get one of the cooks, and have them make some for you to see instead?" What kind of restaurant wouldn't know the names of their signature dishes? Was this woman taking them for fools? Wenqing harumphed. She was about to expose the trickery of this sly woman when Chu Lian sent her a reassuring look. The maidservant bit her lip and waved her hand at the woman. "Then hurry up and get the cooks to make the meal then. Our madam wants one portion of every signature dish you have. Remember to make it quick." "Certainly. Please wait for a moment, madam." After saying so, the woman turned and glared at Akai. She lowered her voice and said, "Akai, come with me to the back to prepare some tea for our guests." Finally, she dragged away the unwilling Akai. It was only after Wenqing had confirmed that the woman and the waiter were no longer within hearing range that she asked, "Third young madam, Gillen restaurant is clearly no longer doing business. Why did you have me place an order for food anyway?" Chu Lian winked mischievously at Wenqing. "I want to see what kind of tricks they'll try to pull." Wenqing scratched her head speechlessly. Chapter 163, Incognito Visit to Gillen Restaurant. 4. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The middle-aged woman was Akai's eldest aunt from his father's side of the family. Her name was Wang Lu, or as most people called her, Mrs. Wang. The entire Wang family of servants had been part of matriarchy's dowry back when she had married into the He family. Later on, they had been sent to manage Gillen Restaurant. Ever since the West Market had been redrawn, Gillen Restaurant's business had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Their finances were perpetually stuck in the red, and had been for the past several years. When the original manager left, the Wang family had been put in charge. Matriarchy had known that Gillen Restaurant was bleeding money, but she hadn't shut it down due to her memories of it. She hadn't inquired about the management either, so she didn't know that the Wang family was running it in this manner. After entering the backyard, Akai tugged at Mrs. Wang. "Eldest aunt, why are you keeping them? We can just kick them out. It looks like she's some minor official's wife. How could they possibly compare to House Jing in status?" Mrs. Wang glared at him. "All you know how to do is kick our customers out. How many customers have you chased out of our doors this month? Although we're helping House Jing'an manage this business, we haven't had a single bit of income for the past few months. It doesn't look good on the books at all. Furthermore, didn't you see those sturdy manservants that young madam brought? It won't be good if we get into trouble. Your uncle isn't back yet." Kai frowned. "Eldest aunt, you're just too timid. We all know that Gillen Restaurant hasn't changed owners yet because of matriarchy. As long as the matriarch is around, Gillen Restaurant will remain standing, and we can live an idle life here. What can a lowly noble's wife do to us?" The moment she hears that we're backed by House Jing'an, she'll probably wet herself in fright. Mrs. Wang sighed, all right. Ah, Kai, eldest aunt knows about all that. No matter what, we have to deal with them first. I wonder which cave that vixen crawled out of. She must have seduced some minor official's son and brought out some manservants to show off. She even had the gall to claim that she's eaten the finest gourmet dishes across the entire country. Humph. She's probably never even had those confections that cook show of House Jing'an makes. Alright, that's enough. Just watch while I cook up some random dishes to satisfy her. When she's done eating, tack on some charges to the bill and buy back half a roast chicken at night for our dinner. When Kai heard Mrs. Wang's instructions, he chuckled devilishly and said, whatever eldest aunt says. The two of them entered the kitchen and Mrs. Wang started cooking. She started with a dish that could be cooked quickly, so that they could buy some time for the rest of the dishes. Mrs. Wang took out a white porcelain plate and was about to pour a pot full of meat into it when Kai noticed what she was doing. He quickly moved to stop her. Eldest aunt, that's for us to eat. If you give that to those people, won't it be such a waste? Kai liked to eat meat. He had nagged Mrs. Wang to cook up some meat for days before she agreed to cook this one pot. How could he bear to let it go to Chu Lian and her party? Mrs. Wang found his childish actions funny and glared at him, but didn't go through with serving up the meat in the end. She moved the meat back into the pot and looked around the kitchen. She then made up some dishes without much care and sent Kai to deliver it to the main hall. After 15 minutes, the waiter Kai returned to the main hall with some dishes in hand. He placed them on the table none too gently with loud thuds. Kai then proudly lifted his chin and said, Madam, look carefully. These are Gillan restaurant signature dishes. Chu Lian looked at the table before her with an unmoved expression. 2 dishes were filled with something so charred she couldn't tell what it was. Another dish to the side was filled with soup, with a pitiful amount of scattered cabbage leaves. The other dish had been broiled for so long that its color had changed and she couldn't even tell what it was made of. The 4 dishes looked completely inedible. Did these people think she was blind? Without waiting for Wenqing to speak for her, Chu Lian said in a flat tone. Signature dishes. I'm afraid these were made to feed the pigs. After saying so, Chu Lian swept the 4 dishes to the floor without the slightest hint of hesitation. The tinkling sound of the porcelain dishes shattering on the limestone floor resounded in the main hall. Wenqing and Wenlan had also been frightened by Chu Lian's sudden action. However, when they looked at the ugly expression on that arrogant waiter Kai, the maidservants were delighted. It was as if they had finally let go of the frustration plaguing their hearts. Their bodies felt light and free of burden. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.